Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Will.
And I'm Luke.
And today we're going to be discussing chapters 14 and 15 of Against the Day. Unfortunately, Cody is not with us again, despite his wishes to be here. That being said, he is currently seeing the Wu-Tang Clan, so that's a pretty good reason to pass up on any other responsibilities someone may have on any given night. Luke, do you have a summary for us for these chapters?
I do. So, chapter 14 opens with Kit Traverse's introduction to Scarsdale Vibe. The setting is the annual Yale-Harvard football game, and the town is riled up. The first mention of Kit's roommate and Scarsdale's son, Colfax, occurs. Scarsdale is lamenting that Colfax isn't more like his father. Next, Scarsdale reveals the true purpose of his visit. He wants to sound out Kit's opinion on succeeding him, even if Kit is known about town as a man with only one thing on his mind, vectorism. Colfax, on the other hand, makes up for what he lacks in the depth department by existing as a man of action. Thus, the pair of roommates seem to cancel out each other's faults. We get a rundown on each of Scarsdale's other sons. Cragmont turned trapeze artist at the age of 13, and Fleetwood became an explorer. Kit eventually meets Fleetwood and many other Vibes at the Vibe Manor out in Long Island, a probably haunted and oddly outmoded 4-story structure. While the Vibes eat breakfast one day, Kit reveals that someone or something visited his room in the middle of the night, just before Mrs. Vibe appears. The reader is appraised of her life so far, or at least the parts most relevant to her contributions to the family name. Cousin Dittany shows Kit the stables, and they hook up. Needing to further unburden himself, Kit spots Fleetwood off in the distance, realizing that he must be home from some expedition or other, but even Scarsdale's brother, R. Wilshire, is in the house, sharing racist songs about African cannibals that Fleetwood cannot help to take offense over, though not for the right reasons. If Fleetwood wasn't a ghost, that is, or if he could be trusted when it comes to talking about his family. Fleetwood and Kit go on a hike, and Fleetwood relates to Kit the highs and lows of his profession. Then Fleetwood tells a story about an encounter he had with the Zionist agent in Africa. Fleetwood and the Zionist agent discussed Jewish history as it relates to their general statelessness. The pair were then attacked by a charging elephant, but Fleetwood saved the day by standing his ground. We move on to a conversation Scarsdale had with Foley concerning the ongoing gold rushes in South Africa and Australia. Scarsdale is so mad that others are getting rich that he suddenly understands the socialist perspective. Back with Fleetwood, he leads us into his memories of Africa. He had arrived there and quickly tried his best to lose himself to the dangerous conditions, till finally he discovered a purpose as he crossed over and into the frontier. He must journey across the veldt and to Johannesburg to make his personal fortune. Once there, he gets into the mining business and at one point is forced to execute a native for stealing from the mine. Though he views this act as karmically balanced out by his prior saving of the Zionist agent, his murderous impulses have rendered him unpopular about town, so off to the Arctic he goes. The next chapter opens with one Lou Basnight as he struggles with perhaps paranoid visions of a lone figure following him. These visions coalesce into a depiction of the Kieselguhr kid, a sort of Robin Hood-esque boogeyman of the bourgeoisie. Lou's struggles with investigating the kid include the fact that the kid's physical appearance seems to shift, and he finds himself talking over his problems with Burke Ponghill, newspaperman for an as-yet imaginary mining town. Another problem Lou faces is the kid's popularity, particularly with eligible women. Lou's conundrum bleeds into his new friend's life. The Ponghills themselves suspect each other to be the kid, leading all into a classic legal conundrum. Although Lou has not been shot at in connection with his investigation, he can feel the metaphorical noose tightening around his neck. Despite this, he does occasionally let down his guard to admire Colorado's natural beauty. even if it has been stained by the machinations of human capital. Lou's allegiance in the struggle between anarchists and the state becomes increasingly confused. Even so, he dives into life in the happening city of Denver, networking and getting drunk and eating steak. But as he goes about his days, he can't seem to escape the feeling that war is brewing, or has perhaps already broken out. Nate Privet, Lou's superior from Chicago, arrives for his yearly inspection of White City's Denver outpost. Lou opens up to Nate about his struggles on the trail of the Kieselguhr kid, and Nate assures him that no matter what he does, the client will continue paying. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Lou continues his investigation, though now in a more passive and lighthearted mode. Next, it appears as if Lou has somehow become addicted to dynamite, and he even begins to somehow trip out and hallucinate. The following section is quite psychedelic. And yet another Gravity's Rainbow reference, Lou's experiments with dynamite have lent him the ability to sense dynamite blasts even before they happen. We get a flashback to the first time Lou witnessed a dynamite blast. A traveling circus came to town and blew Lou's hair back, so to speak. Then Lou is victimized by a dynamite blast himself, likely enacted by the Kieselguhr kid. He wakes up not knowing where he is or how he got there. He is discovered by Neville and Nigel, a pair of British men visiting America as tourists. There's a tarot reading, and Lou finds himself accompanying the British men as they start their journey home. And what an odd journey it proves to be. The group arrives in Galveston, Texas, and Neville and Nigel realize they lack curios to bring home, so they convince Lou to come back with them and stow Lou in a box in the ship's hold.
All right. Thank you, Luke. What did we think of these two chapters?
I like them a lot. They're not, my favorite, because I've said too many chapters are my favorite at this point. But they're chock full of symbolism, but also just some really entertaining moments and passages on a purely language level. Things like the beavers of the brain, I can't imagine enjoying the song as a song, but it's a pretty enjoyable little diversion. Things like Kit trying to get along with all of the Vibe family. There's just a lot of intrigue in both of these chapters, I guess. That boils it down.
True enough. Yeah, I think I definitely like chapter 15 more than I do 14. There is some really interesting stuff, especially in the back half of chapter 14 with Fleetwood in particular. Like this set of chapters kind of showcases like a set of awakenings for both Fleetwood Vibe and then also Lou Basnight. Like first Fleetwood kind of realizes that he actually does want to be a rich person, or at least it seems as though his destiny's moving in there, and then he has another realization of his own power as sort of a white sort of capital owner in that moment with the other worker in the mine that he forces to kill himself. Spoiler alert for something we're going to talk about in about an hour anyway. And then you have the other sort of realization in chapter 15 of Lou Basnight slowly coming to understand the whole sort of capitalist industry is actually not just like something to be suspicious of as he was at the beginning of the book when we last saw him, but also that they're actually like a pretty giant force for evil and would go to no lengths to, no like uncertain lengths to increase their portfolio or their sort of largesse. And so I really like that kind of those two comparisons, people coming to two different understandings from two different sort of positions on the social and kind of capital ladder. I think is really cool. But I definitely much preferred Lou's chapter to chapter 14. I think that there's a lot of really great nature writing in it. There's a lot of really great just sort of like imagery and speech. This stuff where he's essentially tripping on LSD, but it's actually sort of a chemical component of dynamite is really weird and interesting, and also quite fun. and comes pretty close to capturing what it's like to actually be on LSD in written form, which is not an easy thing to do. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed them. When I saw the how many pages we were gonna have to read for this episode, I was a little intimidated, but it's actually not that bad, given the length that they run for.
Yeah, I probably like chapter 14 maybe a bit more than you all do. The opening of it is, which we'll get to, I guess, pretty soon, but the opening of it kind of reminded me of like a Fitzgerald novel or something. It's kind of like a classic East Coast event, the Yale Harvard game that I feel like has been depicted by other people as well as Pynchon. But I mean, yeah, all the parts set in Africa are really fun. I do think that chapter 14 is more like ambitious in some ways than chapter 15 in that we jump around a lot. The perspective jumps around a lot, move backwards and forwards in time. And I know all the depictions, especially of Eduarda and her career and everything, I found really engaging. And I did kind of like that we're getting all this information about the Vibes and the Vibe family, and perhaps some clues as to why they are the way that they are. There's just like I think my favorite part of chapter 14 is probably the whole thing with Scarsdale turning socialist and stuff, which is very relatable and just kind of funny. Chapter 15 I did like a lot too. We're finally introduced to the Kieselguhr kid, which I want to say plays a pretty big, that character kind of dips in and out of the narrative from now on and is present later on. A good amount, I want to say. I could be wrong about that. It's been a while. But yeah, the whole like Lou kind of turning anarchist slowly and realizing, like Kate was saying, the issues he might have with capitalism and the way that the world is working at that time are really interesting. I really like both these chapters. This is kind of, I think, I remember whenever I was reading this for the first time, this is kind of whenever I started to think to myself during that first read that this might be a favorite Pynchon book and that this might be kind of his best work and even superior to Gravity's Rainbow. I don't know if I go that far, but I do think that we are kind of getting into the real meat of the book at this point. Pynchon seems very kind of confident in his voice and his prose style and everything. Like I really like the prose in these two chapters a lot. I think it's better than what's come before, even though we've had some really great prose sections before this. Yeah, I like it when authors do the whole jump around in conversations and offer you kind of very small scenes as they jump around in time and in perspective. And I do think that Pynchon does that in a very kind of virtuosic way in chapter 14 especially. I probably would actually say that these are my favorite chapters so far in the book for a few different reasons, most of which I've already said.
It is interesting to consider the idea that we are getting into the meat of the novel now, as you're saying, because I don't know, outside of maybe Void Corporation by Blake Butler, which I just read, so it's fresh on my mind. But I can't think of any other book I've read where I genuinely have no clue. I have no clue what's going to happen next. I have no clue what the meat of this novel represents. But to consider, that we're nearly 200 pages into it and we're now starting to see character reincorporation and that sort of confidence you're talking about building is super interesting and super exciting. I'm very interested to see sort of where it continues to go from here, obviously. But I do agree that these chapters that we have covered since we took our impromptu hiatus are probably my favorite ones so far from a perspective of the momentum that they've given the plot while also giving some sort of interesting asides into characters or other things that have occurred in this version of America. So I would agree with you completely there.
Yeah, the especially given the last the previous couple of chapters, it's really interesting how starkly these sections feel like they're full of just grim darkness compared to the opening 100 pages.
Yeah.
I'm not I wouldn't even say that it is it doesn't feel like one of those large scale like structural divisions. It's an interesting phenomenon to have it go from essentially very high scale, very light in tone, if not in subject matter, and just go straight into some really heinous stuff, especially in chapter 14.
Yeah, agreed. It is a real contrast between the kind of boys' adventure novel vibe of the first 100 pages, 150 pages to now this. So that does bring us to the opening of chapter 14, where, as Luke has mentioned, they are there for the Yale-Harvard game. The Pinch on Wiki says that this is likely a 0-0 draw from 1899, which how you have a 0-0 draw in an American football game, I really don't know. Like, are you somehow just spending an entire quarter trying to score on the field? Does just constant like three failed attempts at a pass or a run, and so you guys switch sides? Like that concept alone is pretty funny to me. But we do get a reference here to a Harvard chant of a lot of the visiting members of that school shouting Mr. Reinhardt over and over again. This is a random kind of thing that I enjoyed investigating as far as the origin of this particular chant. It is a real thing. To the best of kind of cataloged history's knowledge, how this happened is there was a student at Harvard whose last name was Reinhardt in the 1800s, and his friends didn't want to go up to the third floor where his dorm was, so they would just stand, at the foot of the building and yell up at him. And then eventually, one day during a study session, someone overheard this calling happen, and then they called back, and then it just sort of spread like a virus through the campus of people doing a call and response of Mr. Reinhardt. But the picture of just a bunch of people randomly walking around a football stadium saying that over and over again is pretty comical. And it does match Vibe's derision towards his alma mater pretty well, just from a sort of picture of absurdity. But what the real kind of discussion here between Scarsdale and Kit seems to run around is the idea that all of his children are pretty big disappointments, and that he seems to be soft pitching Kit on becoming his heir. That this is sort of the one person who maybe has taken his lessons or tutelage well, and so maybe he would like to kind of supplement his children in that capacity. But Kit is not interested in it at all. He has at least retained some of his dad's anti-capitalist leanings, in that he feels as though if money has been earned sort of unnaturally or not in a moral way, then he really doesn't want to have any part of it. Now, I guess this is jumping forward a little bit, and maybe this is answered later in the book. Is the whole thing with Dittany a plot to get him to become Scarsdale's heir? Is that too revealing of a question to ask, or is this just sort of a one and done part of the plot for the two of you who have read this before?
I don't remember Dittany coming up again, at least not in a significant way. Really, I could be wrong about that, though. I think Cody is our kind of resident expert on the details of this book.
Yeah.
That's true.
I don't remember her coming up again, but I do think that was the intention.
Yeah, that's definitely probably in there. I did have some other questions about that whole scene, like, does Scarsdale do this to other people? Has he done this to other people? Does he do this like to everyone? I did kind of, whenever Kit was offered the whole like scholarship, I assumed that it was probably a thing where like there were other students getting that same scholarship. So does Scarsdale pitch all of them on being a successor? Because I assume whenever it happened that that is part of like a general program that Kit was joining. I don't know.
If I was to guess, that program would almost be like a search initiative for him to find a successor, in the sense that like he has his sort of, for lack of a better term, amanuensis running around locating like bright younger people to get enrolled in this program, and it's sort of win-win for him either way. Like either he spends money that he certainly has in disposable income to like give this person an education and then essentially trap them in indentured servitude afterwards, or if they turn out to be like exceptionally bright or exceptionally talented at a particular field, then he can potentially figure out, whether or not this is the person that he should really invest in from a perspective of like trying to find an heir. So I think that they're probably related in that he probably uses this program to find one, given how disappointed he does seem to be in all of his children. But there's still a benefit for him, even if it doesn't work out that way.
Yeah, so my impression of the offer when Foley Walker brought it to Kit was that it wasn't necessarily like a pre-existing program, but that it was this, looking at the historical context, this is a generation or so after, not generation after, but like, towards the tail end of like Edison's, like Thomas Edison himself as a magnate rather than just his inventions and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so this would be like Vibe looking at Edison and his other competitors and seeing their methods and seeing that, Edison would go around and find the bright kids and hire them on stuff. And I get the sense, it's a little fuzzy, but I'm pretty sure that Kit was working for Tesla before he was propositioned by the Vibe Corporation.
Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, so I think it could either be like an intentional thing, or it could be Foley Walker's magical alignment with the market to go and find this kid who probably, as this section talks about, disrupt his intentions to democratize electricity.
Sure.
And then he rooms with Colfax, and Colfax says good things about him to his papa, and Kit gets this. I don't know if I would expect that Vibe went out looking for him in any particular way, just because I don't know why the guy who runs the company would be so in tune with like who Web Traverse is and like what go looking for him to steal his son or something, I guess.
Sure.
Which is, yeah, like thematically, symbolically, sure, that's what's happening, but I don't know if it's so intentional.
Well, that's also definitely what Webb thinks too. He thinks it's intentional.
Yeah, it definitely makes Webb seem kind of paranoid.
Mm-hmm.
But it also makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
especially if you've lived that kind of life up to that point.
Look, we're reading a fictional novel, but look at the beginning of this chapter and look at the end. Look at what these two people who we're comparing to one another. One person who is exploring new domains, but domains of the mind, and one who is exploring old domains that don't need to be explored, and where they come from, and all of that. Like if whether or not it's intentional, whether or not Webb's just paranoid, that's what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. So moving from someone exploring those new fields of the mind to the disappointment that is all of the sons of Scarsdale Vibe, we start with Colfax, who is indeed, as you mentioned, rooming with Kit at Yale, and is a massive football star. So there is a funny throwaway line about how Scarsdale wishes that there was professional football so that Colfax would sort of have something to do for a career. He wouldn't have to wait very long, because if this chapter does indeed take place in 1899, then the NFL would be formed in 1902. But it is interesting to hear that kind of a perspective uttered, because that's such a foreign concept. The idea that there would be no outlet for professional sports in that way in America. Just the idea of all of that being centered around college games is kind of interesting just to consider. but we get a sort of a brief backstory of just how good he is at playing. This sort of massive run that he went on during a game once, and then from there we move into Cragmont. Before we get to him, do we have any thoughts that we want to share on Colfax vibe? He's pretty straightforward. He plays football, and he really tries to get Kit laid a lot, as we later see in a couple of pages. But there's not much other detail on him.
I really like that he is like not to say that I love the children of oligarchs, but I do like that pretty much most of these vibe kids are demonstrated to be competent. They're not actually useless. They just are not soulless machines for the accrual of capital.
Yeah, they're not useful for their father, but they are competent, useful individuals in their given field.
Yeah, I do like the fact that Colfax isn't a thief and is like actually trustworthy. Though like that makes him like unfit to be a capitalist. A little detail in there is pretty fun and very
also the idea of Vibe clearly just calls the cops on his own bribing.
Yeah,
because he just has that many resources that he can just pay off theoretically the entirety of the police department.
Mm-hmm. And that he's trying to like bait his kid into taking the money when he's sending him across town to pay his graft payment. That on its own, like the comical sort of mention of like leaving a dollar bill sticking out of the side of the suitcase.
Well, and so then what is he doing then, right? Like I guess what he's doing is convincing his son that he's already implicated in this, no matter whether he's not looking in it or not.
Mm-hmm. But Colfax does not care. He's he just does as he's told. He's very obedient. So from there we go into Cragmont, which is just what a name for a child. If there's ever been like an attempt to give sort of like faux sophistication to a kid, Cragmont I think maybe is the best example I can think of. He runs away with a trapeze girl, and then would return to New York only after they were married. And apparently, their wedding was in and of itself performed on trapezes, which is just a funny sort of. The description of this wedding is pretty great. Does someone want to read out that paragraph? It had been commented upon on 159.
It had been often commented upon that Vibe offspring tended to be crazy as bedbugs. Fax's brother Cragmont had run away with the trapeze girl, then brought her back to New York to get married, the wedding being actually performed on trapezes. Groom and best man, dressed in tails and silk opera hats held on with elastic, swinging upside down by their knees in perfect synchrony across the perilous ether, to meet the bride and her father. A carnival jointee or concessionaire, in matched excursion from their own side of the ring. Bridesmaids observed at every hand up, twirling by their chins in billows of spangling, 40 feet above the faces of the guests, feathers dyed a deep acid green, sweeping and stirring the cigar smoke rising from the crowd. Cragmont Vibe was but 13 that circus summer. He became a husband and began what would become, even for the day, an enormous family.
Getting married at 13 in quite an ostentatious ceremony. It's just a great example of kind of very distinctly like cartoonish Pinchonian humor. I feel like that's something that you would see in like a Looney Tunes cartoon.
I found it like really hard to picture, not like in a bad way, just in terms of like the wedding ceremonies that I've been to all involve you being pretty like reasonably still throughout it. So picturing one where like all the participants in the actual ceremony are like moving the whole time, it's just like I have a hard time like just picturing it, I guess. I don't know.
But like, how do you do vows, or like say I do, or like communicate with presumably the priest who's there and also on a trapeze?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean this is like the intersection of Thomas Pynchon and oh my god, why did his name just disappear? Thomas Pynchon and Tim Burton's aesthetics intersecting.
Oh yeah, that's very true.
All I can imagine is something from like Big Fish.
Yeah. And then this brings us to the third brother, Fleetwood, who was the best man at the ceremony. So that means he was also on one of these trapezes, based on the description of the ceremony itself. And he's the one who sort of we have already spent a good amount of time with. We've read his journal, and he's an explorer. So yeah, we learned that Colfax is quite prolific amongst the seven sisters, which, as I now have learned, is that there was only 7 women's colleges at the time in that area, all sort of affectionately referred to that way, and that Kit just isn't really particularly interested, doesn't appeal to him. But then Colfax does say that when he comes to the house, he'll have a chance to meet his sister Dittany. This is also an interesting one. This is a case where it's pretty easy to like figure out what Pynchon's doing with a name. For those who do not know, Dittany's a pretty specific choice on Pynchon's part that comes with a lot of literary allusion, and meaning from sort of all sorts of eras of history. It could refer to a number of plants, technically, but the most likely culprit that it's referring to is the same as all of the other sort of poems and stories referred to, which is a type of oregano that grows in Crete. And just to give a couple of examples over sort of history, Venus heals Aeneas with Dittany in the Aeneid. In sonnet, in a sonnet, there is a sonnet called Rhyme. I'm sorry. It's used as a metaphor for somebody's lover. That particular sonnet's by Gaspara Stampa. Canto 11 of Torquato Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered. The leader of the First Crusade is healed by Dittany. In an 1857 poem by Baudelaire, he describes his lover as consisting entirely of Dittany, elle tout est Dittane. And then we have some more modern references to it in the Deathly Hallows. Ron is cured by it, apparently. And in the book Kirke by Madeline Miller, Kirke describes it as the queen of healing in medicine. In sort of real life, back in the kind of ages that a lot of this poetry was written in, it was used as an ingredient to flavor wine. It was also seen as a medicinal panacea that was used for basically everything. It was also seen as an aphrodisiac. So it is certainly something that imagistically, both in the real world and in the literary world, is tied up all with concepts of love or sex or healing in general. So given that this will turn into quite a significant experience for Kit once he goes to the Vibes household, it makes perfect sense why Pynchon would name this character that way. What do we think of the weird, I don't even know what's like servants or haunting that's going on in the house? This was one of the interesting things that I couldn't really make heads or tails of. This interaction, like right after he shows up at the house, where it says, despite its aspect of abandonment and uneasy tendency, was still pursued within, perhaps by some collateral branch of Vibes. It was unclear. There was a matter of the second floor, only the servants were allowed there. It belonged, in some way, nobody was eager to specify, to previous occupants. Someone's living there? Someone's there. From time to time, a door swinging shut on a glimpse of a back stairway, a muffled football, an ambiguous movement across a distant door frame, threat of somehow being obliged to perform a daily search through the forbidden level, just at dusk, so detailed that contact with the unseen occupants in some form at some unannounced moment would be inevitable. All dustless and tidy, shadows in permanent possession, window drapes and upholstery in deep hues of green, claret and indigo, servants who did not speak, who would or could not meet one's gaze, and in the next room, the next instant, waiting. And then, of course, we have the sort of situation arrive where someone has come into Kit's room at the sort of middle of the night or the end of the night. So do we have any thoughts on the fact that the house is haunted or something strange is going on? This was, again, something that I couldn't really make heads or tails of myself.
It did kind of remind me of the writing of Edgar Allan Poe, especially the first few sentences that you read. They arrived, after they arrived, that sentence, and some of the next ones. One other thing, it does kind of give you an idea of how big the house is whenever it says distant door frame. Which
Yeah.
we'll get to that later with whenever Kit spots Fleetwood off in the distance, but it's still like inside the house, where it's just that's not gonna, like it just gives you, like I said, an idea of how big it is and how I don't know if it's. I do think it's probably haunted or something. That seems to be implied, at least. It's never stated, obviously. I don't know.
Yeah, I certainly don't make heads and tails out of it. The things that come to mind for me are the kind of the general idea of like wasps being defined by their privacy, and just the idea that in this culture you do not talk about these things that are disturbing, because if you talk about the disturbing things, then everyone has to talk and everyone has to deal with them. Then you have to search through the second story. There's also just sorry. There's also tying really deeply into that same phenomenon is especially I can't imagine there would have been a time that it was more popular to do so than the late 1800s, but the phenomenon of wealthy families having like disabled or deformed children who are hidden away.
Oh, that's a good point.
And there's no reason to assume that there's a material kind of black sheep other than Fleetwood. But yeah, and then I guess the last idea that comes to mind is the idea of just the Indian burial ground trope, basically, but inverted.
Mm. Yeah, all good suggestions for sure. From there, we get an opportunity to get introduced to if I'm not mistaken, this is Scarsdale's wife, right? The person that's talked about in this next section.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we introduce Scarsdale's wife, who is involved in sort of the Society of the Arts, I guess is maybe the best way to put it. She's really invested in plays and musical theater, which is given some funny derision, especially given at this time in history that would have been a pretty new thing apparently, and that she kind of occupies a completely different world from that of her husband, but that it does have this sort of cross-pollination effect that Pynchon refers to towards the end of kind of the description of who his wife is. I love the quote on 162 where it says, "Thus Edwarda and Scarsdale found themselves together every day, and yet leading almost entirely unsynchronized lives, inhabiting each his and her own defective city, like partial overlays in some new color printing process. Scarsdale's in gray tones, Edward is in mauve, hues sometimes." There is a brief reference in here to some of the plays that she has sort of arranged or been involved in the production of. It says here, faux, or she would prefer fake, or as he preferred faux, rather. Sorry, European operettas on American subjects. Roscoe Conkling, Princess of the Badlands, Mischief in Mexico, and so many others. Roscoe Conkling. This was like a whole Wikipedia and like cross-reference rabbit hole that I went on for quite a while, trying to figure out the purpose behind his inclusion in this sort of random throwaway section. And I eventually got there, like at the last possible second, like when I had exhausted the entirety of his like biography on Wikipedia. So he was a longtime member of the House of Representatives, and then also was a member of the Senate. And he turned down appointments to the Supreme Court twice. Once he was appointed to be the Chief Justice, turned down that appointment, and then another time as an Associate Justice, turned it down again. He was a member of like what they called the Radical Republicans, which at that time certainly meant a different thing than it means now. What it largely meant is that he was pretty progressive in his views towards enslaved Americans and then eventually freed slaves. as well as some women's rights issues and, matters of sort of financial means needing to be backed up by actual like gold. He was big into like treasury certificates. But the biggest thing that he was known for outside of his work with Reconstruction was he was one of the people who helped put forward the writing of the 14th Amendment and was part of the group of lawmakers that proposed the 14th Amendment to sort of complete the process of freeing the slaves, and kind of work towards Reconstruction in the aftermath of the Civil War. He also really opposed a lot of the stuff in Reconstruction that would grant significantly more power and freedom back to the states that had seceded. He was a pretty big fan of providing some punitive measures for them, which obviously didn't always work out. But again, the biggest thing that he was known for in this time frame was being responsible for that, or partially responsible rather, for the 14th Amendment. He then would sort of bounce in and out of the House of Representatives before eventually making his way over to the Senate through like a mild political coup, in the sense that like he won re-election after losing his previous campaign, and then immediately began creating like fundraising avenues and political alliances to take over a Senate seat that was opening up in a special election. And he did that successfully, got into the Senate, immediately got put onto a lot of very powerful committees while he was there, and that tied him pretty deeply with the power structures of New York. If we go back to a couple chapters ago, we had a reference to Tammany Hall. He helped reform a lot of that stuff. It certainly didn't stop being corrupt, but his sort of attempts at changing how that structure worked did provide somewhat of an overhaul to it, and it did also make him sort of the top-ranked Republican in New York. And he was responsible for multiple presidential primaries in his time there. He was also pro third term for Ulysses S. Grant. But the biggest thing that happened is eventually he did resign his Senate seat through a bunch of political machinations that is not worth going through on our podcast here, and it's barely relevant. And he returned to work as a lawyer for the rest of his life. However, and this is where I finally got to the point where the relevancy to Pynchon's book here is, he was responsible for making the court case about whether or not corporations are people or not go in the favor of corporations. So if you actually go and kind of read through that legal case, the like definition of personhood was coming from the 14th Amendment. And so he was called to attest for what the framers of the 14th Amendment had on their mind when they were writing like what a person was in terms of the actual sort of politics of the country and how that stuff is governed. And he said that the framers of the 14th Amendment at the time were expecting corporations to be included in that language, which every kind of scholar on the 14th Amendment afterwards has said just can't be true. And the prevailing opinion that has come out of studies of the 14th Amendment by people who, I guess, spend most of their adult life just learning about one particular amendment have said that it is far more likely that Roscoe Conkling sold himself out basically to the highest bidder and perjured himself in court in order to get kickbacks from friends of his that worked in the railroad industry. And of course, with that court decision that gave corporations the same rights as people, essentially, we've talked about this already, but that is sort of why this particular character is relevant from a standpoint of why this family is funding a stage production on his life. So yeah, just a real random aside, but that is why this particular name comes up. Does anyone have any thoughts on the passages about Scarsdale's wife?
I do want to say that as you were sharing those details, I did find out that apparently people, or at least one person, felt like Roscoe Conkling was the handsomest man of his time, which is I guess, believable when I look at a portrait of him compared to other portraits of that time.
He's pretty well groomed for
Yeah,
the 1860s to 90s. Yeah.
but I really I think that Eduarda Beef vibe. Firstly, top tier pension name, up there with Lubaz Knight or whatever you're gonna pick out.
Mm-hmm.
But also just a really interesting, just an interesting idea. The way that because she's described as having been married almost shockingly young, which at that point in time means that she was like 16.
Right.
So she was this girl who got married and then grew up a bit, and the minute her son was old enough to handle a gun, decided, nope, I guess I'm taking over Broadway. Because that's kind of what's implied, right?
Yeah, certainly true.
Just an interesting character, given how little we really know about her beyond this.
Yeah. And then was also like totally fine with one of her sons getting married at 13. As if she wouldn't have learned from her own experience.
Well, carnies.
That's fair. It is quite a collection of people that all share this last name. That much I can say. I think it would be quite interesting if the corrections, which I already know you hate, Will, was rewritten to have the Vibe family as the central sort of premise rather than the one that Jonathan Franzen came up with for that book.
So I have to correct this misconception. I've never read any of Franzen's work. I'm just a blind hater.
Yeah. I mean, I would say you still hate the book though, even if you haven't read it.
I believe that. But
I have read the corrections, and I did actually hate the corrections. So
there we go.
yeah. One thing I found interesting about that whole section, I mean, I was a little bit, maybe not shocked, but it is surprising that she moves in right next to her brother-in-law. That's just kind of, that information is just kind of, if I heard that about somebody else, there's all these assumptions you could make and stuff. And the way that it's framed is like creating rumors and stuff. You can see why. I mean, one thing that I found most interesting about that whole section is there's no mention of the sons at all. Like, it's not clear where they're living, either with their mom or their dad, or with caretakers, or what I'm saying. Like, I don't.
Mm-hmm.
We don't ever get anything about Scarsdale in this whole chapter. Scarsdale or Eduarda ever about them like raising their children, or what their children are doing while they're living their adult lives. Well, the couple are.
I mean, I guess we can do some theory crafting in the sense that Colfax lives at Yale half the year, and then you have, Fleetwood going out on random expeditions and spending a good amount of time in Africa, and then you also have, God, what's his name? Cragmont running away to a carnival at like 12 and getting married at 13. So I'd assume he's still with the carnival. But you are correct in that, like, you really have no idea what the like milieu these kids grew up in the sense that, like, their dad is probably not at home very much and doesn't care about much other than being a busy businessman. And their mom seems to spend time almost completely outside of the house and is maybe hooking up with her brother-in-law. It's not a wonder that none of the kids turned out to be impressive, quote unquote, to like the patriarch himself. It is certainly an interesting thing to wonder, like how does this family actually function? Is it all just through servants and boarding schools or preparatory schools? Good chance that it is.
Yeah, I'm assuming that they were mostly raised by au pairs and whatever boarding schools. Just to bring my obsessions into these things. Eduarda's in mauve and puce, and Scarsdale's in gray.
Mm-hmm.
There's no green there, although it is in the wedding scene.
That's true. And what are your obsessions pointing to as the meaning behind that?
Oh, nothing that's worth praising right now. I just think it's clear that Scarsdale Vibe is a subpar oligarch.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he's obsessively angry at social climbers, which does project a sense of insecurity, if nothing else.
Yeah, he really should recognize that he has the money and he has the power and nothing else matters.
Yeah. I mean, he has his own train. Like, in the 1800s, I don't know really where else you go from there if you have a train dedicated for your own usage. From there, we have this interaction between Kit and Dittany, where they spend some time together in the stable, I guess is the best way that I can put it. Dittany is a very flirtatious woman, and afterwards, Kit is curious if there is something else to this, and then tries to track down Colfax to ask about the matter of his cousin, as it says. And then the two of them have sex again later in the evening, and then we get this quote that Luke made a reference to here. It says, Kit was wandering through the house when he heard piano music coming. He supposed from the music room. He followed the sound, the unresolved phrases that gave rise to new ones equally unfulfilled, chords he had himself hit by accident, sitting on piano keyboards and so forth, but had never considered music exactly. He moved through a darkening amber light as if the electric current in the house were being drained away, smoothly diminishing like gaslight beneath a hand at a hidden valve. He looked around for the wall switches, but could see none. Far down at the end of one of the corridors, he saw a dark figure receding into the invisible, wearing one of those pith helmets explorers were said to wear. He realized it must be widely discussed Black Sheep Fleetwood vibe, in from one of his expeditions. First of all, I love that he's wearing a pit helmet at night indoors, as if to announce the stuff that he's interested in. But also, yeah, it's a great passage that points to the scale of the house, but also points to this concept that like Fleetwood also has a talent in the sense that he maybe could have been a pretty solid piano player. If it's literally making Kit consider what music can be or what it can sound like. It's a great introduction to the character, and then is pretty excellently used as a transition to the piano being played derisively to make fun of him, seemingly for multiple nights in a row by the rest of his family. And it really does endear you to a character that you know is not a good guy, but you can understand the embarrassment and frustration of what he must be dealing with every time he goes home.
I had not caught the musical aspect. That is an interesting detail that I don't know if I've ever seen anyone mention.
Yeah, it caught my eye when I went back and reread the passage again because I just wanted to focus on like the language of it. But yeah, it seems to be that like all of these kids have a genuine talent of some kind. One of them is very good at sports. One of them is very good at acrobatics, which is certainly also athletic, but takes a tremendous amount of coordination and focus. And then you have Fleetwood, who seems to have potentially had a latent talent for piano, but either didn't feel comfortable exploring that or didn't think that it was what he should do, and so you have him kind of being the one that's closest to his father in terms of what he ends up doing, and I think that makes it profoundly tragic. I think some of my identification of that comes from the fact that I had a dad who all three of his daughters all wanted to do something creative. There's me who wanted to be a writer, and then there's the eldest who wanted to be a journalist, and then a philosopher, and then was talked out of all of that. And then my middle sister wanted to be like a pastry chef and got talked out of it. So I'm very very familiar with kind of kids or siblings who have a lot of potential in one area, who get talked out of it or explore something else that ultimately isn't as fulfilling. I think that's probably where some of my identification with the passage comes from.
Yeah, it's so clear that they all favor their mother in that way.
Yeah.
Now I'm trying to think. Okay, so what about Eduarda?
What about her in regards to what are you thinking?
Well, it's just that like Scarsdale, we really haven't seen any acumen from him. We
That's
know
true.
that he inherited his wealth and he inherited the mentality of his wealth, and that Foley Walker pretty early in his like independent career um, took up most of the actual legwork of
Yeah.
the operation. So anyway, just trying to think about the whole idea of just there's so much scorn towards the Vibe children in this chapter, and there's so much doubt
That's
surrounding
true.
everything. It's just interesting.
Yeah. I wonder if some of that doesn't come from the idea that this chapter is told from the perspective of Kit, who came into the orbit of this family and these children through their father, where a lot of that scorn comes from, right? Um, and so that has kind of infected the prose in a way where certainly it would appear as though Kit is kind of expecting one thing, and at least through his conversations with Fleetwood that come up over here in the next couple pages, definitely seems to get something different from Fleetwood, especially as Fleetwood kind of talks about some of the regrets that he has in terms of kind of traveling and expeditions, about how a lot of it is about money. So I think some of that definitely comes from sort of the perspective that you're orbiting in. But I agree with you that like a lot of my questions and kind of with what Luke brought up come from the standpoint of what is the mother's role here? Because I think it's very clear how Scarsdale views his kids and also probably what their relationship is kind of like. But it is significantly less clear how that, plays in with the way their mother either raised them or didn't raise them, or what kind of influence or appearance she has on their life in the first place. There's a lot of interesting sort of questions to be mined out of this chapter in that regard.
Yeah, it is interesting that she does musical theater and then her kids use and her brother-in-law use musical theater to, I don't know, the Pigeon Wiki says that they're trying to make Fleetwood scared about what he's about to do when he's about to go to Africa. I don't really think that's in the actual text because
No, either. It seems like they're just making
yeah,
fun of him.
they're either making fun of him or they're like causing him flashbacks so they don't realize it.
Hmm.
But it's hard to tell like if he ever actually voices his offense to anyone. Maybe he voices it to Kit and that's why we get that information, but Kit would be kind of a safer person to say that to than anyone in your own family, I guess. In a family like that, like the vibes. It's because the song itself is kind of it's meant to be problematic, and everything.
Yeah, that's for certain.
Yeah, I mean it's written from a colonizer's perspective on like it very much others like the natives it's talking about. So
It's extremely hackneyed from a musical theater standpoint. Opinion on Pynchon songs to the side. This is not a Pynchon song. This is an R. Wilshire vibe song, and it's
Hmm.
terrible. It's like
Yeah.
it's offensively bad. It doesn't scan properly on the page. I picked up the meter. I picked up the rhythm. It's not good. It doesn't work.
Hmm.
it does kind of have a. I mean the Pigeon Wiki I do think is correct with the pointing to the Guns of Brixton by the Clash. Where it does kind of have that like I'm not great with musical criticism and stuff, but it's like kind of reggae ish beat to it. I
Yeah,
actually don't mind the song. I mean, if through the lens of that, or I mean, I also, I mean, talking about the Pigeon Wiki a lot right now, but it also the Bad Boys, like the Cops theme song. I do think that there could have been Cops references to the television show Cops in Bleeding Edge. I think we talked about that a little bit. Where it's meant to be, I do think it's meant to kind of be reminiscent of songs like those two songs, or I'm not sure about those two actual songs. If it's meant to be like super reminiscent of those two specifically. I don't know. I like Pinchin's songs more than I think anyone else on the show, though. So
I can't remember what the standard is, but like this is written to a standard. It's this. So I'm not sure that the Bad Boys, the Cops theme, illusion is necessarily there. But I mean, what it might be, but what this song, what the African Antics show is doing, is a lot like what Cops was in pop culture, and a lot like what going back to Mason and Dixon, the musical about the black hole of Calcutta. In that it's this way for people of the colonizing nation. In the Cops example, it would be the colonizing nation being the wealthy or the white middle classes of America, looking at the inner cities, and drawing a line between the criminal and the good citizen, right? And so, regardless of whether the illusion is there, that's what it's doing. It's doing the exact same thing. Of, instead of saying what you're gonna do when they come for you, which in the song is about the cops, but in this song, in this book, is what are you gonna do when those bad black people come for you?
Yeah, very true.
there are some details of the lyrics I like. I mean, the might even make you late for work thing. It's just kind of funny to me to picture white people in Africa on their way to work, and all these natives roll up on them and try to kill them or something. I mean, I'm sure that happened at least once or something. I mean, it's just a very of its time type thing. And then you won't find no hot dog stand. That's a very New Yorker thing to say, number one. And number two, as somebody who has, I've spent probably cumulatively 2 years of my life in Southern Africa, mostly in Zambia, almost all of it in Zambia. And there is a paucity of other type of food other than just the local type of food. There's, you can find some Indian food. It's basically Indian or African, specifically Zambian food, which is not super different than other countries around it. And that does stand out in terms of the realities of being there for a long time. Where I know that my grandparents lived in Zambia in the 80s, and they would have to drive from Zambia to South Africa to buy stuff like ketchup, and they'd have to drive all the way back with all this ketchup and all this other stuff that you could only find in South Africa. And I'm sure that those problems with not having Western comforts or European comforts or American comforts while you're in Africa would have been much worse in the late 1800s, early 1900s than it was in the 80s and 90s. So that's all. I do like those little details in the song, I guess. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is also quite crazy how long this apparently goes on for, given that it says that he spends at least 32 bars a night trying not to take offense. So they're just running this over and over and over again to mess with him, which is just awful. And then, of course, we have this kind of back and forth between him and Kit, where he says that they don't actually know that he's there, and if they do, it's only in the same way that some can detect ghosts. So you may have noticed already, these are not the most spiritual of people. I once had hopes that Dittany could escape the general corruption, but not so much lately. And then they kind of go back and forth about sort of why Fleetwood has kind of ended up as the black sheep, and sort of how he enjoyed at first going out and exploring and seeing things, but now it's turned into explorations for sites of capitalism. So kind of building off of what you're talking about, Luke, it's building towards having more of those Western comforts in these these kind of unexplored or undeveloped territories to the colonizer's perspective and the money that can be made out of that. And then he goes into this story about a Zionist agent named Yitzhak Zilberfeld, who was out scouring for possibilities for a Jewish homeland in Africa. And the two of them exchange a couple of pretty interesting lines in here, especially to read now, about how as soon as you kind of build fences or you build a neighborhood, it becomes about keeping things out of that neighborhood, and that even if sort of and that kind of illustrates what he's doing in looking for a Jewish homeland so that they can kind of build their own territory. But then that hatred that existed for Jews, that anti-Semitism that he's making reference to, doesn't just dissipate. So where does it go? And they kind of have this back and forth, and eventually here's a line in here that says, "Of course not, but no Jewish homeland will ever end hatred of the unpropertied, which is a given element of the suburban imperative. The hatred gets transferred to some new target, that's all." It's just, I'm not going to elaborate on that, but there's a certain irony in 2025 about this particular conversation that I'm aware that Pynchon probably didn't understand the full implications of, at least when the book was published. And then there's this funny situation in which an elephant starts charging towards them. This Zionist agent accuses the elephant of anti-Semitism, which is also really funny in the modern era as well. And then eventually he gives Fleetwood a sort of a stock tip, in the sense that he says that he should go buy Rand shares in the gold fields that are in South Africa. So what do we think about this back and forth, this dialogue between Fleetwood and the Zionist agent?
I have a PSA, I guess, for everybody, where if an elephant is charging you, you are actually supposed to run. You are not supposed to stand your ground. I've been charged by elephants. I mean, it's pretty far off, but it was running towards me and my grandparents one time. It's a long story. I mean, we were staying at a hotel. There's a elephant in the middle of the hotel, like it's all kind of spread out, just like the central area of the hotel. There's an elephant in there, and they hit it, and somebody threw a large stick at it and hit it in the forehead, and started charging us. We were probably like at least 50 yards away, and you're supposed to run. So I don't know exactly where Pynchon is getting I think it's funny, and I don't think it's necessarily supposed to be realistic, but it's just you're not, basically any African animal that's bigger than you, and even some that are smaller than you're just supposed to run. So
yeah, that's interesting, because I have, and it coming from much less personal experience and much more like stuff written to idealize sub-Saharan Africa, but like I have read similar things as this statement that you're supposed to just make eye contact with them. So that's good to know. I'll update my travel plans
whenever you're inevitably charged by a elephant in North America.
Yeah, of course. You never know when the mastodons will come back. Regarding your suspicions of Pynchon not knowing his impressions, I'm pretty sure he knew what he was talking about, Kate. I mean, think about it. He was writing this in like the 90s and early 2000s primarily. Like,
Yeah, that's fair.
Illegal immigration was becoming the hot topic in the USA.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what the overwhelming kind of belief in Israel or knowledge of Israel was at that time. But that doesn't necessarily indicate that Pynchon wouldn't have been able to see past that.
I hope this is viewed as a positive stereotype, but I have to commend the Jewish people for being equally cynical when they are individual agents looking for Zion in the wilderness of Africa, as when they're waiting in line at the deli.
They're a stiff-necked people. This is literally what the Bible says about them. So,
go all the way across the planet looking for a new homeland, and you're just talking about how it's a waste of time the whole time.
Well, it's got to be pretty hot where he was at, and that at least for me anyway, gets me in a disposition to be pretty upset and grumpy.
Other than that, I don't know. I think it's just a fascinating intercession, I guess, because Fleetwood really makes a lot of the fact that he apparently gave this guy the same advice that he got, and maybe he gave the advice real good or something. But I'm not really sure what would justify even like a very narcissistic idea of, oh, I've saved this man's life. This is a karmic credit.
I mean, if this is taking place after the incident, or no, it would be beforehand. So I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, if this event was taking place after he had done what he did in Johannesburg, then I would totally see why he would be seeking that karmic credit. But given that it's taking place before, maybe it's just a general sense that he has to make up for the family he was born into. Somewhat that idea that if you're kind of like what we talked about with Alex Phoebe when we interviewed him, just to give a plug to that episode if you haven't listened to it, that idea that like living in the first world is kind of inherently a crime in a way because of how much the first world takes from the third world and the global south in order to prop itself up. So maybe there is some degree of kind of wanting to make up for that. And maybe that's why he not only sort of left home in the first place to become an explorer, but also, why he's dismayed at the fact that this thing that he kind of found for himself that he enjoys, that seems to be the antithesis of what his family cares about, given the way that it's derided by them, that even that is turning towards capitalist ends. I could see a situation arising where someone would want to kind of make up for those factors of the circumstances of their kind of birth and upbringing.
Yeah, I guess now that I've asked the question, I'm looking back at the lines where basically the Bush Gazette apparently says that he saved him from insane elephant, and then Fleetwood says, "I used to read Dickens as a child. The cruelty didn't surprise me, but I did wonder at the moments of uncompensated kindness, which I had never observed outside the pages of fiction." And so I guess it would be kind of like he gets these referrals essentially, and he gets the specific tips, and he's like, well, I have to justify this somehow.
So I might as well go there and become a horrible person.
Yeah, or I might as well think that what I did by happening to be here and giving you the right advice that you deserve to get, I did do something great. I do deserve to buy Rand shares.
Yeah, it's a nice aside scene, which leads into some really, really awesome writing as he kind of journeys towards Johannesburg. And just to kind of give a brief reference to the last episode, the Rand shares are in reference to a series of gold mines that were located in South Africa, but not in the British colony, in the Transvaal, which was still held by the people that were collectively referred to as like the Boer peoples. And a failed coup to take over that land and bring it into the British Empire led to the war that there's a reference to in that conversation, which was the Second Boer War. So he then depicts that he sort of had a death wish for a while. This particular kind of reference I quite enjoy. On 168, in Africa, he had known saintly lieutenants who were fated to die young, fugitives from all across the wreck of the Eastern Question, traders in flesh or firearms indifferent to the nature of the goods they handled, who would emerge from the green otherworld after months. Their cargo vanished not only from possession but from memory as well, sick, poisoned, too often dying, cursed by shamans, betrayed by magnetic anomalies, racked by guinea worm and malaria, who, despite all, wished only to return to the embrace of the interior. Fleetwood wanted to be like them. He prayed to become one of them. He He went out into the country even the local European insane knew was too dangerous, hoping to be invaded by whatever it had to be, but nothing took. No one had the bad taste to suggest that it was his money keeping away the spirits whose intercession he sought. That even those agents of mischief somehow knew better than to get close to unregulated funds whose source lay in criminal acts, however difficult to find. So I think that gives a lot of indication that there was something within him that did despise those circumstances of his birth and did despise those circumstances of his upbringing, and that somehow if he can die exploring, or if he can die in the exact opposite circumstances that he grew up in, then somehow that absolves that or makes that easier. But instead, it would appear as though that money actually insulates him. And so, kind of at first not understanding why he's doing it, like sort of Will you're talking about, with just like, I've been given this tip and it was a kindness, so I have to make use of it. He goes off to South Africa, and as he's headed there, he realizes he's actually headed there to make his personal fortune. That this is what he's engaging in, and it doesn't give a lot of detail as to kind of his thoughts about realizing that, but after it goes through kind of a really well written paragraph, kind of outlining what his experience is like in this sort of like quick, just sort of list of items or experiences that he kind of goes through, we do finally get the detail of the story that he was asked about at the Explorers Club, in which it is said that he had shot at somebody, but in actuality, despite it was being suggested that A, he shot at someone, and B, that it was an Asian migrant worker, probably a Chinese migrant worker. Instead, we learn that there was somebody who had been caught stealing a diamond, which may be true, may not be true. Certainly, the individual who was caught, quote unquote, protests to the opposite, and that what he basically said is like, you need to, one, give me the diamond, then B, you have a choice. I will either shoot you or you can just kill yourself by jumping into this mine shaft. And there's this moment that's pretty powerful in my estimation, where he realized that in that exact moment, he could have this person do whatever he wanted, that he could have asked this guy to do anything, but that all he was capable of was thinking of this, and that has a lot of different implications. It does mean that he could have asked him to do something to like give a penitence for, quote unquote, stealing the diamond. He could have asked him to become his personal servant. He could have asked him to do, any number of things to either make up for it or just forgive it. Maybe reassign him to different work and he would just go do it. He could have told him to leave and never come back. But instead of that, all that he come up with was literally killing him. And it seems to me that there is something in that leads, it leads Fleetwood to understand that maybe he is not so different from the rest of his family. And that terrifies him. And so he cuts his time there short, not with a personal fortune, but not necessarily poor for having been there, and leaves in the first sort of instance that he can. And that ends up being the ship, the Vormance expedition that we've already gone through the sort of timeline of over the course of the book. But all the way through there, he is tormented in his dreams by this idea that payment for the life that he took, payment for what he chose to do, is eventually going to come up sooner or later. And he assumes that it must already have been. I saved this particular Jewish man's life, but it turns out that is not the case, and instead the payment for his sort of absolute hubris is the unleashing of whatever evil they unleash when they extract the meteorite out of the mountain on the Vormance expedition. What do we think about this kind of end sequence of events in this chapter? It's chock full of meaning, certainly.
We did skip over the short conversation that Scarsdale has with Foley, where Scarsdale professes that, or confesses that he understands the socialist communist mindset, which is Scarsdale's like pretty
true.
unhinged. Yeah, Scarsdale's pretty unhinged in this chapter. And that conversation is really funny to me. Just I don't have any. It doesn't remind me of anyone or anything like in terms of like at that time or even now. But it's just a really like a very rich person being so mad that other people are getting rich for pulling metal out of the ground, oftentimes themselves. I think at that point, it's just I find it. I don't. It's maybe not laugh out loud funny, but it's just very. Whenever I think about it, it just is very fun, like to picture and to think about this ultra capitalist person suddenly understanding his opposite political viewpoint, just because of how jealous he is of how much money they have. Although that's obviously not. That would be a very regressive summary of socialism and communism. Is just that it's people being jealous of other people. But anyway, yeah, I just really love that part. And the stuff following it with Fleetwood, it is interesting to me that the narrator uses, I'm not going to say the word out loud, but the K word a fair amount, which is, that's a very, I get why and stuff. That's basically, I mean, I feel like I'm not 100% on the history of that word as it relates to its American counterparts, but its American counterpart is basically the N word, and it's
Oh, really?
just very, yeah. It's not, I have no problem when American authors use that, even if they're white, in terms of portraying racist people, because there are people that still use that word, white people, it hasn't really, um, I've never heard an African person, like a black African, use that word, whereas, I've any number of times have heard American black people use the N word, where it's been somewhat reclaimed in America, or there's kind of a good way to use it if you're of that ethnicity, and there's a bad way to use it if you're not of that ethnicity. But there's just the bad way to use it in Africa. It has no positive connotations or denotations. It was a bit shocking the first time I read this book that it was in there, and I was also shocked whenever I revisited it because I didn't remember. I don't have like I said, I don't have a problem with Pitchin using it. I just feel like there's a lot of like it's not like he's not like that word does not mean like if you were to put in like the Africans, that's not what that word means. Like the Africans called it E. coli, the natives called it E. coli. It's like a much worse word than any word you could put in those sentences, I guess.
Gotcha. I did not know that.
I took it, it's used in concert with a slightly less intense slur, referring to the Asian migrant workers and indentured servants. I think it really is supposed, like, as far as like its purpose as the word choice, it feels very much like it's just highlighting the degree of othering in the modern term sense that's going on in this culture where Fleetwood is sure he's smoking daga, he's probably smoking some opium too. Sure he's hanging out with all these people. Sure it's on the opposite page to where that those terms come up. It's painted pretty clearly that he really wants to be African in that like that heart of darkness kind of Colonel Kurtz not really be African kind of way. So for him, they're just they are that.
I agree, and I do think that, like I said, people. This is set in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it is kind of. I imagine the use of that word is much more widespread by white people around that time. I mean, I do think it's still used by white people in Africa, but yeah.
I've heard people recording shows for the BBC use the word, so yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I've never really. I've only. I don't. I make a point of whenever I'm there of trying to hang out with locals, just because I've been going there since I was 6, so I know locals in Zambia, and I've never heard it actually said out loud by basically anyone. Just because I'm not always the biggest fan of the way that the white people I meet in Africa talk, and stuff like that. I've just had bad experiences, and so has my family going back a long time. So I haven't been exposed to it at all. I do know that it's like, not something that you would ever say if you're there trying to, make friends make friends with the right kind of people, I guess. Anyways, yeah, I do really like this whole section though. It is kind of, killing somebody by making them jump down like a miles long mine shaft. Like that person's going to be dropping for a while. I mean, it's a very like tough way to execute somebody. Where you think that there'd be kind of more humane ways to do it if because Fleetwood does justify it by saying that the person would have been killed for it or beaten up for it for the diamond that they were trying to steal supposedly, and that he was just basically a mercy killing is how Fleetwood frames it, and I would not personally frame it as in any way a merciful way of killing somebody. So it is pretty obvious that Fleetwood doesn't view these people as equal to himself. Another thing is that a lot of this section, the ending section, it's just Fleetwood monologuing at Kit, apparently, where it is framed, even the part with the Zionist agent is framed as just a part of the story that he's telling Kit as they stand on that hillside. So it's written in his vernacular.
I think he's probably trying to unburden himself.
Well, I don't know if I think that this last section is actually narrativized in the real in the real world of this book. Like it reads to me as a kind of a general Pynchon summarizing his subconscious in between the time that he killed the worker in the mines and when he went to the Vormans expedition.
I guess there is a page break between the section with the Zionist agent and then eventually the section in Joburg, and then there is that aside with Scarsdale.
Yeah, so there's the section break, and then it says, the opening of that section ends with it. The opening of that section ends with he was remembering declining into a sickbed of remembrance, and then it moves into a pretty much non-narrative form right until the end, where it is Fleetwood thinking about the way that it was really a mercy killing. Really, it says that trails off into an ellipsis, and then that came later in the dreams, along with the unavoidable face of the dead man. So I don't think he's sharing this stuff with Kit. I think this, although I can't quite tell, I took this as all being post Vormans expedition, and so Fleetwood being so introverted at the family reunion and hiding to himself and speaking with so much like scorn towards the rest of his family, despite having come around to accepting that he belongs in it. I'm not sure that Fleetwood at the end of this chapter doesn't belong anymore, or does belong any more than he does at the beginning of the chapter, if that makes sense.
That is interesting to think about the different sections of this book in terms of like their timeline in relation to one another. Because a lot of that's very, very unclear to me. Where you might be, I do think you could be correct in that it's not part of the Kit and Fleetwood conversation, because if Fleetwood is wearing the pith helmet when he's home, that means he'd be home from Africa and then about to go on the Vormans expedition.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a lot of this book. The timeline of stuff is unclear in relation to one another, and there's also anachronisms. A good amount of anachronisms throughout the entire book.
That is very true.
Yeah, and I do think that that's intentional. I don't, like Pinch not the type of person to. I don't think there's like some like I don't think you can like write a paper about what the anachronisms mean, in my opinion. But I do think that that's intentional, and that like Pynchon obviously does his research. Like I've talked about in the past with the Tesla section earlier in this book is like people. Apparently, Pynchon was reading so much about Tesla that people thought that the book he was working on at the time was just about Tesla. And, Tesla's not a super major character in this book, and that just shows, like Pynchon really does a lot. I do think he does extensive amounts of research for each of his books, and I don't know how the anachronisms could not be intentional. And it all just kind of contributes to a sense of maybe not confusion, necessarily. It's just I don't think you can like piece it all together if you really wanted to, like what happens when in relation to one like to other parts of the book, especially in this chapter. I do think that that's perhaps a commentary on the way like history is written, and just how kind of messy summarizing or trying to depict like epochs in American history can be.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Do we have any thoughts on this chapter before we move on to the next one?
There's one big thing. Scarsdale Vibe is referred to by Foley Walker as Mr. V, with the capital V and the dot after it. And it's being written by Mr. V himself. So
we finally found it.
No, I do find it interesting because it does it. I don't know. I think that exchange that Luke brought up and we've come back to a couple times. I think it's might be deeper than it really seems because I'm not. I don't know. Like I think you're right, Luke, when you said that it's a bit of a scant definition of socialism or communism, but I think it's an interesting analysis of the psychology of these kinds of people.
Well, I also think it's that particular conversation does seem to be a summary of how old money views new money, especially in America, but really kind of across the Western world and probably across the entire world for all I know.
Yeah, especially given that he refers to them as climbers.
Yeah.
It's specifically the line, "My mind, or the part of it I use for thinking about business matters, aches." What is this part of his mind that he's thinking about business matters with that is also being damaged? Is it just his ego? Is it his sense of fairness? Is it that yeah?
Maybe this is getting into the weeds a bit. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I think that what that's getting at is that like a lot of these super rich people, and the easiest one that I can think of is Elon Musk to draw this comparison to, oftentimes like to engage in that mentality of like you need to earn things for yourself, you need to like start things up yourself, the like work hard and eventually you'll get dividends for it, that whole kind of mindset, when in actuality a lot of these people have already been set up for success by people before them. Like Elon's father literally owned like an emerald mine in South Africa. And when he was working on PayPal, he was already rich. And when he was like funding Tesla, like there's this story about him, sleeping on like billionaires' couches or whatever, but he still had a lot of money that he got from the payout from PayPal and all of these things. And it all stacks back to the fact that he was coming out of a wealthy family, and a wealthy circumstance. And that's the case for a lot of people, like even on a smaller scale, like Anthony Bourdain, for example, which I'm only thinking about because I'm currently rereading Kitchen Confidential. He did get a really like great TV deal, and he did write a really great book, but a lot of that was still influenced by the fact that when he was growing up, his father was incredibly wealthy, wealthy enough that they were able to go over to like France for months at a time, and he was able to attend like a private college, and then had contacts in the publishing industry. when he was becoming a writer. So a lot of people actually do have a lot more help than they either like to admit or than is perceived about them. And so Scarsdale's this guy who, as you mentioned at the top of the show, inherited a lot of this money and has a guy who makes all his moves for him, essentially, and is threatened by these people out literally doing like hard manual labor to achieve a wealth that isn't similar to his, but is approaching the realm of it if they continue to strike a rich time over time. So I think it's an insecurity from the perspective of kind of the pose that he affects versus what's actually going on there internally. And that it is easier to view that through the lens of kind of this derisive view of people who support something like socialism than it is to simply accept that he got lucky and that these people are actually working incredibly hard for the chance to become wealthy.
Sorry, I keep trying to go. I have a few responses in every way. I keep coming to think about to phrase them. It sounds like an insult in my head. It's not. It's not. I think you're. I mean, it comes right after the bit about Fleetwood feeling guilty about getting the tips from the what's his name? Yitzhak Zilberfeld.
Yitzhak? Yeah.
Feeling guilty about getting all those tips, and so it's just like a doubling of that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Is what you're reading, kind of would say.
Yeah, well, and I think it also illustrates the difference between the two of them, in the sense that, like, he gets this tip and he feels obliged to follow up on it because of this idea of like kindness and kind of repaying kindnesses with kindness, whereas, his father is. It just becomes incredibly aggressive at the concept that there are people making money. And so I think it's also meant to illustrate that difference between the two of them in a mindset. And I think that a lot of this chapter, especially in regards to Fleetwood in particular, is trying to build an impression in the reader's head of kind of a tragic figure somewhat, that leads to that horrifying scene where he forces a man to commit suicide against his own will. And that, like, sure, he is the black sheep of the family, and sure, he does have some more progressive views than certainly his father might, but that doesn't change what it is that he's done, and it doesn't change what it is that money has the capability to do to somebody if they start to accumulate it or are in a position of power.
That makes sense. I'm just hung up on this, on the very particulars that we really don't need to keep discussing.
So then, in 15, we're reintroduced to Lou Basnight. For people who have been following along with the show for a long time, since we started doing this season anyway, does one of you guys want to give a brief refresh on who this character is, for any listeners who may have forgot?
I don't know how good of an introduction I can give, or a reintroduction I can give to him, but I mean, currently he's a detective for White City Investigations. He's the head of their Denver outpost. He was based in Chicago. But the deeper into the book we get, it does seem more and more clear that he, I mean, kind of has some weird ability to like jump dimensions or something, where like it does seem like he either that or he has some type of amnesia problem, which oddly the whole jumping dimensions thing seems more plausible to me. But he started off in some small town, I think in Illinois, and he got kicked out because of some horrible thing he supposedly did, which he does not remember. And then at the end of this chapter, I interpreted it as him experiencing some type of explosion or dynamite blast and not remembering where and how he escaped, or where he escaped from and how he escaped, and where he ended up going. Which could be him yet again jumping into a new dimension, or him just once, or it's just memory problems. It may not have been the best introduction, but yeah, that's what I remember about him.
Yeah, so the last time we saw him, he was working for White City in Chicago during the World's Fair, and was the person that the chums had to take up in their airship to get a view of the ground below. And then that was where we got that introduction to his character from a perspective of the fact that suddenly he had committed a crime and he didn't know what it was, and then he was brought into this hotel with crazy dimensional qualities, where he was doing like pretty menial service, and then eventually found his way into being a part of White City. So we're reintroduced to him here, and we, as Lucas said, now he is in charge of this Denver outpost of the investigation corporation that he works for, and then he is trailing after somebody. Does anyone know how this term is pronounced? Kieselguhr. I don't actually.
It.
Yeah.
Kieselguhr.
So like the traditional German pronunciation would be Kieselguhr. I think the way that a good American should pronounce it is just Kieselguhr or something.
Okay. So yeah, the Kieselguhr kid, which kind of kicks off one of many allusions to Gravity's Rainbow in this chapter, because there's of course the pretty famous Kenosha Kid segment of Gravity's Rainbow. But for those who don't know, Kieselguhr is essentially one component of dynamite. They say it on the page, but it's mixed with nitroglycerin to make dynamite. And that he has been tracking this particular person for a while, trying to figure out who he is, trying to bring him in for questioning. And that he seems to be kind of this marauding adventurer who has a lot of allusions to the Unabomber, in the sense that he has very specific complaints about sort of industrialized society, and also picks his targets out very specifically, addressing his sort of explosions to a person in the same way the Unabomber did as well. But we do get some backstory for him on this first page, where it does say that the kid's family had supposedly come over as refugees from Germany shortly after the reaction of 1849. What this is a reference to is a series of revolutions and uprisings in multiple nations that were democratic and liberal in their constitutions. This was all stoked by dissatisfaction broadly with leadership across different nations in Europe, more desire for participation in government, freedom of the press, and sort of an anti-monarchical sentiment that was brewing. The interesting thing about this is it was largely built up of a series of they weren't really in contact with one another, near as I could tell from my research, but disparate groups of sort of individual workers that banded together for a cause that were also joined by some middle and upper class people as well. These coalitions, for the purpose of these uprisings, did not last very long. They broke down pretty quickly, as you can kind of expect those things to break down, given the massive difference in mindset that would exist, especially in the 1800s, amongst those different sort of levels of class in society. But the revolutions themselves, while pretty much all failures for the most part, did typically lead to good reforms that they were looking for anyway. So these attempts at revolution and these uprisings were pretty much all put down really violently, but there were some victories. For example, in Austria and Hungary, there was an end of serfdom. There was an end of the absolute monarchy in Denmark. There was a representative democracy that was established in the Netherlands as a result of these. And then there was also the beginning of the Second French Republic in France as a result of these demonstrations. So there were indeed some refugees that left Europe because of the kind of violent backlash and violent crackdown. But it was this very fascinating period that you can read a lot about, where a lot of these individual kind of resentments that were shared across multiple European countries all kind of kicked off at once. Not unlike the Arab Spring protests that happened in the 2010s. It's one of the biggest sort of comparisons that you'll find to more contemporary history, as far as what that's a reference to. We also get some details about kind of what he's been doing just kicking around in Colorado. He isn't just investigating this one particular person, he's kind of become a catch-all investigator for whatever work the Pinkertons can't pick up, or whatever work that White City sort of more or less buys the contracts off of other detective agencies because of the fact that these labor disputes and kind of union conflicts with management have kind of spread so widely. So he's kicking around Denver in a lot of cases, spending his time there for the most part. We get a reference to a Dr. Lambroso, who is a real life, I hesitate to call him a scientist, given that he is essentially a eugenicist. He is most famous for promoting the concept that criminality is inherited and that you can actually see it in someone's facial features. And his policies would eventually be a major source of inspiration for Mussolini in his acts cleaning up the streets, but then were also spun out into other eugenics projects, a lot of other racist projects, a lot of phrenology as well. Would kind of pull ideas from that same sphere, and it's all building towards the same kind of racist ideas that there are people of inherently lower class or lower society or inherent criminality. So do we have anything that we want to talk about in sort of this early introductory period of the chapter? This is a pretty long chapter, which a lot of it is just kind of him investigating or sort of kicking around, looking for clues until a bit towards the end when it gets kind of psychedelic and weird.
The detail of the kid and his family settling at first near San Antonio is interesting, considering they're German. That area of Texas, Central Texas, like mostly closer to San Antonio than Austin, has a lot of German history. There's some pretty big Oktoberfest celebrations in that area that draw tourists and stuff, which Cody could obviously speak a lot more to that small detail in the text than I could, but I have lived in that area, and that is an aspect of life there even today. I do think it's interesting that the kid is kind of portrayed as this like Rambo type figure in some ways. You know, he has these like bandoliers across his chest and everything. I mean, later in the chapter, we get the fact that his the kid's appearance seems to change over time. And I do think that the backstory we're given could just be like the legend. The people have kind of spun around the kid, and I do think that the kid could be multiple people or like some type of, I don't want to call it like I don't know if it if it like some type of like spirit that like or like legend that would like possess you into like doing these bombings. And then so I do think it's possible. I've seen speculation online that Lou eventually turns, or even in this chapter, turns into the Kieselguhr kid. You know, the explosion at the end of the chapter, it could be him having blown something up intentionally because his Antichrist sympathies have kind of boiled over, and then he just forgets about it because he was hurt in the blast himself or something. I think it's quite possible that Webb is part of the legend of the Kieselguhr kid as well, which would kind of make him, if he has taken on that persona, or if he is that person, then that would definitely make Kit being targeted by Scarsdale a lot more, like his paranoia about that, a lot more justified. If he was this like legendary character who was doing all this like inspiring of revolutionary action and thought, which is interesting to think about. I really kind of generally love all these sections that involve the Kieselguhr kid.
I find it interesting that this Burke Ponghill character
is going through his mail.
Well, no, I mean, where is this mail come from? Because it isn't said, unless I missed it. Like, did Lou just bring this mail with him, or is this random this prospective mining town newspaper writer is getting the mail from this guy? That's real weird. Like, both of those situations are really weird.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the interesting thing of that is that there is definitely a way to justifiably say that it's either one of those things, because like the town isn't real. It's basically a real estate trap because it's just sort of a mud bog. The kind of like ore that they're hoping to export also hasn't been found and also kind of isn't real. And it does say right at that moment Lou was out in the field in Lodazal, Colorado, chatting with Burke Ponghill, the editor of Lodazal Weekly Tidings, which is just a great name for a newspaper. Very funny. The newspaper of record for a town which, as yet, was little more than a wishful real estate venture. It was young Ponghill's job to fill empty pages with phantom stories, in hopes that readers far away would be intrigued enough to come and visit, and maybe even settle. But so far, all we've really got is a mining town that ain't built yet. Silver? Gold? Well, ore anyway, containing this metallic element that ain't exactly been discovered? Maybe discovered, but not quite refined out. Useful for applications yet to be devised? Well, say, sounds good to me. Where could a fellow get a room for the night? Hot bath, home cooked meal? There you go. The wind swept through the brittle brush and both men lit cigars. Lou tried not to succumb to the weariness of the trail. The voice in these letters, Ponghill tapping the pile of loose sheets in front of him, far from belonging to some crazy, passionate South European or semi-educated Peter specialist. It suggests instead an hombre who knows full well that something has happened to him. But for the life of him, he just can't figure what. You know that feeling? Sure. Who don't? He trying to work at, though, here on paper, how it was done to him. And better yet, who did it. But by damn, look at his targets. You notice he always identifies them by name and address, without getting all general as to some of the bombers do. None of that Wall Street or Mine Owners Association. No, see, these evildoers, all clearly indicted, one by one. So, you're right. I don't know where the letters are coming from, and this is a man who has been literally indicted by the writer of the book as coming up with the stories to fill in his newspaper. But like, there is a part of me that wonders if the Kieselguhr kid isn't just Lou, because of the fact that the two of them have similar backstories, in the sense that like, the Kieselguhr kid, knows something happened to him, and sort of knows who to target, right? And Lou is the opposite of that. He doesn't know what's happened to him, and he doesn't know who to target. And over the course of this chapter, he kind of learns who he should be targeting, who the like forces that control the world are. So they're sort of like these mirror images of each other. But it's also entirely possible that the entire thing is made up. But then, of course, that asks the question of like who he talks to at the bar, right? There's so many different ways to go about breaking down just that interaction, especially with all of the different things that we've already sort of set up in this book, with how the Iceland spar interacts with the narrative, and kind of the two different worlds, and the fact that Lou does seem to hop between worlds, and all of that. Which is all just sort of a long-winded way to say I think there's multiple ways to interpret this.
Yeah, I guess as you were reading out that last thing from Ponghill, it did occur to me that it sounds a whole lot like an author characterizing their own work.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked my earlier question with the idea that maybe Ponghill's writing all of this, so that's not like a revelation, but it does sound a lot like that to me.
Yeah.
Because, like, he ain't in it for no fun, Mr. Basnight, nor the thrill of the blast. Nope, got us a man of principle here. That sounds like an author talking about their own hero. That doesn't sound like someone talking about some stranger sending them letters.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that if you want to look at it as a perspective of kind of the Kieselguhr kid is a mythological character that's invented by this newspaper man, but because of his backstory of kind of knowing who did something wrong to him, it endears Lou to that character because he wants to be like that. He wants to understand what's happened to him. And so that makes him open to the series of revelations that occurs over the course of the chapter, until eventually, he starts experimenting with bombs himself.
Burke Pong Hill of this all is very fun to me because as dubious a character as he might be, and as much of a scam artist as he is, even if he's not doing anything more than what we're explicitly told, he does relay this crazy story where basically his two brothers got into a fight over how much they agree with this Kieselguhr kid guy. And then the one brother proceeded to set report the one who's in favor of not killing the kid to prison. He just gets locked up over that is how I read it.
Right.
And it's interesting to me because firstly, Burke Pong Hill Guru Confessional is how that little story is framed to us.
Yeah, after the brown jug came out.
Yeah. And then it ends with Burke basically saying the best hope Brad can hope for is to stay alive until the trial gets moved down to Denver. But his name is Burke Pong Hill, and I don't know about the hill side of things, but Pong is Pong. Or ping pong, I guess, if you're 80 years old. And Burke does mean like to silence or to shut up.
I did not know that. That's good detail behind the character, definitely.
But no, it's just all them jismatic juices.
Just backing up. You don't know what to do with them.
Nope.
The body has very finite energy.
Both of these chapters are kind of horny.
Yeah, the interaction between Kid and Dittany is pretty out there.
Yeah. I mean, I have no argument against the Dittany interaction. I'm not sure this is too horny.
I don't know. Just anytime you invent a word related to, I think jismatic is pinch and invent of that word, basically. It's just, which is an odd detail maybe to focus on, but it's also, it's not something that you hear about all the time, I guess.
Oh, so now a guy can't come up with a penile neologism without being accused of horniness.
Mm-hmm.
Woke scolds.
Utter woke nonsense. Do we have any other thoughts on this conversation between him and the newspaper publisher? I think it's hard to come up with a sort of direct interpretation of it.
I guess this is a full-on conspiracy corner thing that doesn't even. Great. It's not big enough to warrant really its own section. But you could really forcefully read the interaction about like the mining town not being built yet and what they're going to be mining as Burke trying to talk to Lou in the same way that Webb tried to talk to Merle earlier.
And oh, sure. He's just like missing passwords and stuff.
Yeah, and so you could read it as Burke himself being the Kieselguhr kid, and he is he feels guilty because he got his brother in prison, and he's got all these thoughts about what's motivating him because he has those thoughts. Also, he's got uranium because that was an interpretation of the earlier conversation, months and months ago.
Yeah. I don't know. That doesn't seem that crazy.
I think it makes a lot more sense that he's just trying to, paraphrase his own bullshit.
Yeah. I mean that is, I think, the most straightforward explanation. But it would what you're throwing down. I could definitely see some interpretive work going on there.
Some.
So from there, we get some more sort of detail of kind of what it's like in the land that he's working in. Some beautiful nature writing that exists in this chapter in particular, which has been a lovely feature of a lot of Pynchon's books as a whole, but especially sort of the two that have a lot of connection to kind of the West or wide open expanses of kind of nature imagery. And then we get to kind of get some detail about how he left Chicago, and then eventually, in this sort of ending paragraph on 175, we get this really wonderful realization. Does someone want to read that paragraph starting with "not so long ago" on 175?
Not so long ago, he wouldn't have known how to take sides. In the course of his anarchist hunting days in Chicago, Lou had found his way to a convenient insulation, for a while anyhow, from too much sympathy for either victim or perpetrator. How could you walk into the aftermath of a bombing and get anywhere by going all to pieces over the senseless waste of life, the blood and pain? Only slowly would it occur to his ultra-keen detective's reasoning that these bombs could have been set by anybody, including those who would clearly benefit if anarchists, however loosely defined, could be blamed for it. Neither, in the course of long pursuits down back of the yards and beyond, was it escaping his attention how desperately miserable were the lives found among the realities of anarchist communion. Though it promised a man his only redemption from a captivity often cruel as the old Negro slavery. Crueler, perhaps, crueler sometimes. Lou began to find himself entertaining seductive daydreams about picking up some surrogate bomb, a chunk of ice, or better, a frozen pile of horse droppings to sling at the next silk hat he saw serenely borne along in the street. The next mounted policeman beating on an unprotected striker.
It's just a really excellent sort of way to describe his shifting mindset and kind of the thought that maybe there's something else going on here, and maybe I'm working for guys. Of course, there are a lot of historical examples of what he's describing actually happening from a standpoint of subversive elements being kind of planted into crowds to take protests from being peaceful to violent, or from someone trying to escalate something or literally planning kind of an event to make a political point or to create sort of an enemy of another people group. This is something that happens all the time. You look like the Gulf of Tonkin or the World Trade Organization protests. So it is not unheard of to see this happening at any point in kind of like pretty complex political times. In fact, according to the book itself, he makes a reference here to the uprisings at the Pullman plant and McCormick Reaper when he was in Chicago in just the very next paragraph. And these are two pretty major events that took place in the kind of like labor organizing and labor time frame. In the case of the Pullman plant, this eventually led to the army getting called in, and the army is what started the violence and kind of got this thing blowing way out of control. And then eventually they were, justified to completely shut it down. But essentially what happened with the Pullman strikes, this is something that occurred in 1894, and it was as a result of both layoffs and reduced wages after the Panic of 1893, which we talked about on an episode a really long time ago. But that was when the markets had like a panic and a crash over all of the speculating that was happening in Argentina, if I remember correctly. And so this led to like a worldwide sort of recession. And one of these things is that they stopped building new train cars. Pullman was a train car manufacturing company. They built mostly passenger cars. And their management was pretty draconian. They required anybody working for them to live in the company town of Pullman, which is just outside of Chicago. And they were literally not allowed to purchase a house. They were not allowed to reside anywhere else. They were not able to do anything from a perspective of their actual like living environment. If they were going to work for Pullman, they're going to live in Pullman. And they laid a bunch of people off, and they slashed wages for the people who they kept because of the Panic of 1893. And they also increased utility costs for the apartments that they were forcing all of their workers to rent from. And there was no union in place because of the fact that this was a manufacturing job and not a like railway workers union was essentially the reason why. But the ARU, the American Railway Union, came in, signed up all the workers at Pullman for the union. Their first attempt to strike wasn't too successful, but their second attempt, what they decided to do instead, was to have all of the other elements of the union, so all of the people who actually like worked on railway lines and were conductors and the people who would handle like switchovers and everything, to just refuse to pull any Pullman cars. So if a train was going out of a train yard or going into a train yard or switching stations or whatever, the railway workers would literally let all of the train go except for the cars that have been manufactured by Pullman. And this was a pretty disastrous strike in terms of its effect on the actual sort of general populace. The boycott on Pullman cars actually grew to include 250,000 railway workers spread across 27 states. And eventually, the president, who at the time was Grover Cleveland, got involved and was trying through any legal means possible to get this strike to stop, the boycott to stop. He declared it as like an illegal strike that was taking place, and that was when he sent in the army. And then the army basically started the violence in a bunch of these different cities, and then that led not only to the actual putting down of that strike, but it also led to the head of the ARU going to jail and the ARU actually being disbanded. So it was a massive, massive loss for union leadership in the railway industry and in the manufacturing industry outside Chicago. So certainly that thing would have been something that Lou Bass-Knight had seen before. So he's not grasping at straws at all. And then the other reference, the McCormick Reaper, we've talked about this before because it was a strike for an 8-hour workday that led to the Haymarket Affair that kind of coats that first chapter of the book pretty heavily as far as the talk of anarchists and labor unions as a whole. But still, just an incredibly well-written paragraph of his kind of realization and his shifting mindset. Then we get this next paragraph, which is pretty crazy. It says, the altitude, the scale of the country out there put a balloon-headed clarity onto vision and directed at mine owners and workers alike, revealing the plutonic powers as they daily sent their legions of gnomes underground to hollow out as much of that broken domain as they could before the overburden collapsed. Often is not on top of their heads, though what it did matter to the powers, who always had more dwarves waiting, even eagerly to be sent below. Scabs and union men, union and scabs, round and round, changing sides, changing back again. Sure didn't help with what he felt, no embarrassment in thinking of the contest for his soul. So this is very clearly a reference to the conflict that the Chums of Chance see actively going on page 117 when they're flying through the earth. What do we think Pynchon is saying here with this comparison?
Sorry, just to clarify, you're asking the comparison between these two moments in these characters?
The sudden like bringing back of this under the underground conflict, because it's been kind of not mentioned until this exact moment since we first saw it.
I do think that there's an aspect of what he's talking about that concerns like I forget exactly when this was most popular, but from living in Colorado, I do know that there have been times in the past, and even just having read European literature, like classics and stuff, that there have been times in the Western world where being in the mountains or being in a place that has that is higher up and being like for various reasons, it was thought to be healthier or like that it would help solve like various ailments or like chronic diseases and stuff. Colorado Springs has a park called Garden of the Gods, which is very popular just with tourists and people in general. And the reason that it's called that is because it was like originally like a beer garden or something, but it was like part of I think some type of resort or something. It's not public land, but it used to be like privately owned, and the whole thing was people were sent there to like convalesce and stuff. So that's a whole part of Colorado's history that I think he's kind of getting at. Although it does seem to be a little bit more like not that Lou's health is getting better, but he's getting clarity on what's happening around him. But I do think that's an aspect of like the kind of wonder of, or the effect of altitude, and the kind of sense of wonder. Or I don't know. It's Lou seems in some ways like amazed at how there are no clear sides in the conflict, according to him at least, and that seems to kind of seems fascinated by that, I guess, in some ways as a detective. I don't know.
Regarding the earlier gnomes underground and how it relates to this, I guess it feels maybe like it's because sure there were gnomes in the scene with the chums going into the center of the earth, but they were gnomes that were in the earth already. They had their own queen there. They're not being sent down as much as, their queen might be more literally Plutonian. She's not the one who is sending these gnomes down. I don't draw much from the contrast between those, aside from the sheer contrast of the idea that this is an internal conflict in one scene, and this is a forced upon conflict in another. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I just think it's interesting because, like, obviously, he's talking about the plutonic powers being the capital owning class, the mine owners, sending their legions of gnomes, the miners underground, to hollow out as much of the broken domain as they could before the overburden collapse, hollowing out a mine for the ore that's within it. And then the dwarves waiting are scabs, right? I just think it's interesting that he uses the same words that he does for that conflict in the center of the earth. And I don't know, that feels relevant to me for some reason. Even though just from a perspective of the like mythological creatures that he's using to describe scabs and mine workers, it still maps. But since we'd seen a conflict playing out that way, I don't know. Something about that just stood out to me as being particularly relevant, as if what's happening above ground is affecting what's below ground, or that the two are sort of linked together in some way. But that also could be me being totally crazy.
Well, the whole bilateral distributions of dichotomies, I guess. There's, you can argue the chums of chance are cheery and dayful and explicitly anarchist, if implicitly, working for the powers that be, who are dragged underneath by Miles, or dragged in conflict by Miles getting unintended messages. And Lou Basnight can, there's the line of reading his name as Lou Ba Night, as in like flew by night, and him being a worldly mirror to the chums of chance. And so he, instead of them being explicitly anarchist and factually not, he kind of the complete inversion of that. And so he is standing there as a witness to these crimes and formulating an understanding which places the, by the end of this chapter, firmly places the workers as victims in this dynamic.
Sure.
But as far as taking it beyond that level of pure contrast, I can't go personally beyond that at the moment.
It does seem to me that he seems that Lou sees no difference between scabs and Union men, or that they're one and the same. They're switching sides for whatever reason, and that does seem to me. And part of what you were talking about with the underground and the above ground, a big part of post-structuralist philosophy is that there are no opposites. I've read some of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, and that's a big aspect of those two books. And that's just an interesting way to view. And there's a whole. I've read stuff online that interprets various Pynchon novels through the lens of post-structuralism, and you can get into like jargon problems really easily with that, in my opinion. Anyways, I do think that I would assume that Pynchon is at least vaguely familiar with post-structuralism, given how popular it was in the 70s, and I think in the 90s as well. This would have been, if not started, then beginning to approach. I mean, I do think he probably worked on it Against the Day a good amount in the 90s, I would assume. I don't know.
I'm just going to interrupt to remind you of the Deleuze and Guattari Italian wedding fake book in Vineland.
Yeah, definitely. That's true. Good point.
So from there, we get some more detail about just sort of Denver at the time. There's a reference here to Ed Chase, the boss of the red light district. This guy doesn't have a Wikipedia profile, which I was very surprised of, because you can read a lot of individual articles chronicling different aspects of his history or different places where his name has come up. And it surprises me that I could not find just like a standard Wikipedia page of just some history, but with like references to other sources. But essentially, Ed Chase was a criminal leader, he's a criminal mastermind for the red light district of Denver at the time. He later became a city councilman for the city of Denver, and then he sort of became eventually a Republican power broker for the state itself and its electoral politics. And then eventually he parlayed that into becoming a real estate investor, and eventually sort of became like a real estate magnate and a pretty big capitalist towards the end of his life. But a lot of the detail here about like the individual streets and historically where the different places Lure is going does all seem to be founded in very real history and very real research. We do also pick up on the fact that he is now starting to be recognized by mine workers, and that while he usually was able to pass by them kind of without a second glance or a second word, now they're asking questions of him and treating him a bit more suspiciously. And so he started to carry his Illinois and Colorado license with him as well, just to kind of have an additional level of sort of proof behind his name. We also get some good detail about his office. Pynchon seems to love a messy office, like a messy desk, and just sort of messy environments like that. He's hired multiple people to try and help him sort through all of his case files and all of the evidence that he's gathered, and just to kind of keep things going as the constant influx of work from the other detective agencies, continues to show up. But they all quit. They all move on to other jobs. They all move on to other things. Too much work. It's too exhausting. And so from there, we again get some other detail of his actual investigation work, and sort of the fact that he is now doing a huge amount of work for just one person in this one satellite field. We get this detail that nearly every workday in neighborhood saloons, eating houses, and cigar stores, he found he was running across and even getting in conversations with folks from both the union and the owners' associations who previously had been only names in field reports. The really odd thing he began to notice was that some of the names of owners' operatives were also turning up amongst his files on the mine workers. Some were wanted by authorities in distant states for crimes against owners, and not always trivial offenses either. Union outlaws, even anarchist bombers, yet here they were at the same time on the payroll of the owners' associations. Strange, Lou muttered, puffing energetically on a cigar and grinding it to shreds in his mouth with his teeth, because he was getting a sick feeling, not all from the swallowing tobacco juice, that somebody might be playing him for a sap. Who were these birds? Dynamiters pretending to work for the owners while they planned more outrages? Owners' stooges infiltrating the WFM to betray their brothers? Were some of them, God help him, both greedy pikers playing both sides and loyal only to U.S. currency? And the answer is probably all of the above. There was a lot of kind of, for lack of a better term, fuckery going on at that time, not just from the union end, but also from the owner's end and vice versa. That all of the stuff that he's coming across is really just illustrating to him that this is all kind of one giant sort of cynical mess. And it it's again another case of just like this kind of slow awakening that he's having, which is absolutely great. And then we get this other detail that after sort of going up onto a mountain, people are not sure exactly what he is. He's not exactly a mine worker. He's not exactly an owner. He's sort of interrogated by these Ku Klux Klan members who are guarding the mine, and they aren't able to sort of figure out who he is or what he is. And I think that that's the perfect kind of match to what his mindset is. And then we get another reference to a real life historical figure in which, after sort of getting past the Ku Klux Klan members, he says that they're doing a fine job of security, and I'll be sure to pass along that to Buck Wells when I see him next. Buck Wells was a Chicago-born, Harvard-educated member of the Telluride Mining Association, who is particularly noted in history specifically for his hostility towards unions. He was convinced, and this is a quote, that laborers were beneath him and sought to have the head of the Telluride Miners Union hanged by accusing him of murdering a mine. That was never substantiated. There was never any evidence. They did find the mine guard's body, but they don't know what happened to it. They don't know how he died. And basically, this whole thing was potentially an organized murder being carried out, not necessarily maybe by Buck Wells's hand, but by people on his payroll to give them a reason to get rid of the leader of the actual Telluride Mining Association. So it is a perfect kind of historical reference that Pynchon is using for the evidence and kind of confusion that Lou is beginning to sort through. And then there's a lovely paragraph at the end of this section before the page break about how Lou isn't even really sure what this conflict is anymore. That it looks like a war, but nobody's calling it that. And it's again another moment of just wonderful writing by Pynchon's perspective of how to sort through kind of the historical muck here and properly break it down and showcase what it would be like to try and understand it as it was going on, because we can speak from a very privileged position of like settled history on these things, but to try and make sense of it in the moment, I think would have been so much harder, which is exactly what Lou's trying to do.
Yeah, gotta appreciate, a good old scene where the KKK is made out to look like a bunch of morons.
Yep. In true Tarantino fashion.
Yeah. They say, "Too tall for a miner," said another. "Healed too. I think I saw him on a poster someplace." What do y'all make of that phrase? Because I honestly just don't know what it means in this context.
Healed would mean that he has a gun. So presumably that would make it seem as though he was on a wanted poster. Which,
no, that if that's a slang term that means that, then that makes 100% sense.
Yeah, healed is a slang term for like carrying a firearm at the time, anyway.
Thank you for being much more abreast of Western conventions than I am.
You're welcome. But it does point to the fact that like Luke kind of said, is he the person that he's chasing, or has he started to become the person that he's chasing? It is interesting. It could also be that the miners have started to take notice of him, as is kind of described in a lot of these sections, and they're putting up posters with a drawing of him on it, saying like, "Hey, beware for this guy. He's actually working for basically the Pinkertons." It could be either of those.
I mean, you could think I saw him on a poster someplace about pretty much anyone in this time period. I would assume, even maybe not today, but you could say similar things about it, which is just it's just kind of a baseless accusation you can make to anyone. But I do think it's interesting that Lou is supposed to write down the phrase "dynamite them all and let Jesus sort them out," in terms of his, especially in terms of his viewing both sides as as the same. It's never explicit whether or not the Kieselguhr kid, whether all of his victims are his enemies or if there are civilian casualties or not. Which even with the events later in the chapter with Lou himself being somehow blown up, I guess he's investigating. Technically, he's still investigating the Kieselguhr kid around that time, so he could be a target, but he also could be a bystander. He also could have been caught up in his own bombing, if you want to interpret it that way. Or the bombing takes him to a different dimension somehow. You could even say that, I mean, there's parts of the New Sun where Severian dies and is reborn, if you want to interpret it that way. And I mean, that's the same thing kind of seems to happen to Lou as well.
From this interaction, the next time he heads back to Denver, he discovers that Nate Privet from Chicago has showed back up and is doing his yearly inspection of Lou's office. And this is an interesting interaction because essentially what Lou explains to him is that if he doesn't find the Kieselguhr kid, that's fine because the Pinkertons just keep paying us because we're keeping on anyway. And this is where he learns that they sort of are being floated by his investigations out here, that he is more or less subsidizing a good chunk of the company by taking all of these extra cases that they're not being paid for on delivery of a suspect, so to speak, but rather being paid just for the work that's happening. And so this is really where Lou kind of continues to ramp up his cynicism because he realizes that a lot of this work that he's doing is kind of in vain and is not even meant to be finished. And that this is another instance of just trying to grind out money from a source. Do we have any thoughts on this interaction between the two of them?
Just going off of the element that you were focusing on, the curious part of it to me is that the beginning of this chapter basically describes what's going on as, and I'm not sure this, I'm quite sure it wasn't the first time, but essentially that the Pinkertons had decided to start in a very different world. They would have been issuing certificates that promised future labor, not futures in stock value, not futures in commodities, but futures in labor. And the idea that not only is labor being traded as this thing in itself, like I'm selling you this job. It's also being treated by the instruments who have instrumentalized this labor as a pure future, as something that has no expectation of actually delivering the promise. And that's just a fascinating angle to look at this through. I really take this this section as essentially Nate coming as clean as he ever will to Lou that no, there is no Kieselguhr kid. I know this, you know this, we all know this. It's your job to keep writing the papers to say that there is one.
I mean, it's almost like they're pursuing a superhero of some sort. In some ways,
it would certainly point towards the idea that this is a character invented by the newspaper, or at least the newspaper maybe received letters from a number of sources to create the character, and that that there is a Kieselguhr kid in the sense that there are bombings happening, but that he is an excuse with which to pin those things on the anarchists. That this is a whole cloth invention for the purpose of inflaming the labor war.
I do think it's interesting that the Pinkertons, like the specific detail that the Pinkertons have outsourced the job to White City, because there's stuff that it kind of implies, perhaps their agents, their detectives have been targeted by the Kieselguhr kid, and they've lost or come close to losing or had casualties. on their side, so they're just paying somebody else to take that job over because they, it pays, but it's a shitty job or whatever. You're gonna it's dangerous, so they don't want to lose it, or they do want to they don't want to lose their own people. It kind of reminds me, I forget what movie or TV show it is, but I do remember there's some crime related TV show or movie where some a boss of a crime syndicate pays somebody to kill somebody else, and then that person pays somebody else to do it, but it's a lesser amount of money, and it goes down to 4 or 5 people of lesser and lesser on the scale in the gang, all being offered less and less money to kill somebody because none of them want to do it. Where it's just money's I'm sure that the Pinkertons are probably still somehow making money off the fact that White City is working on the investigation as well. Where they, what I'm saying, where that has to be in the contract somehow, or why would they not keep the ticket for the account?
I think that happened over the course of season 4 of The Sopranos.
You are right. I've seen The Sopranos probably 3 times now, so it hangs out there in my subconscious a lot.
I'm sitting here trying to nail down anything other than that arc in The Sopranos.
I should make Sopranos references in Bleeding Edge, so
yeah, definitely. And I think that is. I can't imagine that's not a real thing in the world of organized crime.
Yeah, you would imagine so.
The interesting thing about the Kieselguhr kid is that I think there might be anarchist bombers who are doing this. There might be bombings that are being pinned on anarchists. It really doesn't matter, because what I kind of get out of it is that it doesn't matter that it's the Kieselguhr kid or that it is a Kieselguhr kid. What matters is that it's not the unions. What matters is that it is someone who it can't be blamed on the actions of the mine operators.
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly get to meet the Kieselguhr kid, or maybe the Kieselguhr kid, in the very next scene, in which Lou is left to toil alone again as Nate goes back to Chicago. And so he goes into a bar. It quickly becomes very packed, and then suddenly a figure approaches him, and it says here, later he made it back to the anarchist saloon, and there, as he'd half expected, was this customer giving him one of those unfinished business looks. Probably not the Kieselguhr kid, but Lou, by now being in an experimental frame of mind, decided to go on the assumption. So, this still doesn't prove that this person even exists, as we're talking about. And the more that we have talked about it, the more that I am fairly convinced that there is no Kieselguhr kid, and that it is an invention to justify sort of the continued escalation in the war against the labor unions. But that doesn't change the fact that the conversation they have still makes sense and still works, in the sense that this particular, I'm going to assume, union man basically says, hey, have you figured this out yet? And I think that probably what he's getting at there is that this is not, you're on the wrong side, essentially. That some of the things that are happening, we're not even doing, being used to kind of blackball the whole sort of union industry and experiment as a whole, and try and get us back underneath the owner's control. And he could even be talking about the perspective of have you figured out that this character isn't real anymore, because of the fact that they probably know what he's there investigating, given that he's now a recognizable figure. And Lou decides to humor him and say that, let's say that I have, and then we get basically a foreshadowing of the end of the chapter, at least in my perspective. And then he says, well, you're going to be an anarchist on the run then. If you've figured out that that this whole thing is unjust and that we are actually the victims here, then they're going to have no excuse but to try and get rid of you, because essentially you know too much. And then the man kind of slips back into the crowd, and that's the end of it. Lou tries asking him about sort of the innocent people that may be caught up in all of this, and the individual he's talking to says that there have been no innocent lives taken, at least not by his hand, which of course implies that there have been innocent lives taken by other people. And then he sort of buys Lou a beer. He's passed whatever test he was potentially giving him, and then slips away into the mobility, which I learned by reading these chapters that's what the word mob is short for. Do we have any thoughts on the conversation between the two?
I think it's really interesting. Firstly, that that whoever this union man is disavows the phrases of bourgeoisie, peasantry, and proletariat, despite using them. Even more so, the idea that Lou believes himself that because he was never so sure of his own authority or his own justice, that he wouldn't have ever, committed quasi-legal killings of people wanted for bombings or whatever. And it's just an interesting line of reasoning.
Yeah, I didn't catch that. That's a good point.
Getting me confused with Pat Garrett, Wyatt, or hard cases with Frontier never cared, nor maybe knew which side they were on. Not having had that luxury, I wouldn't have done you in then any more than now, when I know better. I think it justifies the extreme sarcasm that his interlocutor uses, calling him a screaming red threat to society. But it is interesting because I'm not like, obviously it's not like a logical proof, but it's interesting because it doesn't even feel like it falls into common sense logic. It does feel completely out of nowhere, except through the lens of like Pynchon logic, that like post-structuralist logic that you were referring to, Luke.
Any other thoughts on their conversation that you may have had, Luke?
I mostly just find it interesting that he knows that the person is probably not the Kieselguhr kid, but he just, as an experimental thing, goes into it assuming that he was. 'Cause I do think that could speak to the Kieselguhr kid just being like, I mean, he could have just been the boogeyman, like kind of like y'all were saying, like like a fictional character, I guess, created to other the anarchists, like blame the anarchists or something. But it also seems, I mean, to me, it seems more like the Kieselguhr kid is, like the hero of the union members, or like he's more, like countercultural, and that he's something that like he's something like to rally around for them, and that like if you believe that he exists, maybe you would do a bombing yourself, and therefore kind of keep the whole thing going, where then you would perhaps be blamed or called the Kieselguhr, or that the bombing that you did would be blamed on the Kieselguhr kid. I don't know. I mean, I could talk about that kind of stuff for days, I guess. I mean, in Gravity's Rainbow, there's all this Slother becomes Rocket Man. There's a lot of discussion of Plastic Man. That kind of stuff is just, I love that Pynchon kind of mix things similar to comic books, or like classic comic books, or even comic books of the day.
All right. So after this takes place, that seems to have been kind of Lou's cue to leave White City Investigations, because we start the next page break with a description of Nate rattling off one telegram after another, sending out to the regional office. But it says here that there might as well be hired roughnecks with wire cutters on every pole and 1,000 miles between them for all Nate was ever going to find out from Lou anymore. So it's clear that after this interaction at the anarchist bar, Lou is just sort of, he's just kind of done. He's decided to sort of move on. And then this is where we get into a very weird detour until kind of the end of the chapter, where Lou has been handling a bunch of dynamite or explosives. It specifically says must have had his gloves off, and that he experiences. How do I even explain it? He's been handling explosives, and then when he goes to dinner, he basically has the effects of being on acid. is the best way that I can put it. This whole thing is very reminiscent of the first documented case of someone being on acid, which is often referred to by the holiday bicycle day, where the person who synthesized it in a lab was bringing it home with him from the lab. What was the specific? Was it on his hands or on his leg or something like that? That when he was bicycling home, he started to have the effects of a psychedelic experience.
He'd been handling it with his hands, I think, right?
Yeah, I think that's as much as the myth goes.
Yeah. So also was handling it, hadn't washed his hands. Not that really would have mattered depending on how he was handling it. And then on his way home, suddenly he started experiencing very intense effects of what we now understand as LSD. Except in this case, when Lou is in the restaurant that he goes to after handling these explosives, he starts to catch additional details of his steak. He sees not only the origins of the steak, but whole sort of cities and a race of very small, perfectly invisible inhabitants who as they seethed and bustled about, to all appearances unaware of his scrutiny, sang miniature, though harmonically complex, little choruses in tidy, speeded up voices whose every word chimed out with ever more polycrystalline luminosities of meaning. So essentially, he's having a full blown trip, and his steak is singing to him out of little people that are inside of it. This is a case where the song's pretty funny. I don't normally like pinch on songs, but this is pretty entertaining. And then from there, people start to react very negatively. So he must be looking real weird in the restaurant. They're running away, and that he is finding that it isn't just his steak, but that kind of a lot of other stuff is kind of enhanced when he's experiencing this from a standpoint of colors and sound and all of that. So then he goes and sees a doctor who refers to it as cyclopropane plus dynamite. No reason we shouldn't call it cyclomite. Go ahead, free samples today. Take as much as you like. It's pretty stable. So if it was blasting work you wanted it for, you'd have to use detonator caps. DuPont number 6 has seen work as good as any, though you might also want some plasticizer for it. Some say it helps with the all-over effect. He did not quite add easier on the old choppers as well. But Lou somehow sensed that was coming, so he shook his head vigorously, grabbed the goods, muttered his thanks, and left as quickly as he could. And so at this point, it would appear as though he's going to start using it pretty often. The allusions to acid are very clear. It is certainly not hidden whatsoever. And I would go so far as to say that in anything I have read, this section does the best job I can think of explaining in the written form what being on acid is sort of like, between this and then eventually his experience that he has by the lake that introduces him to the British people that eventually take him across the pond. So what do we make of this thing? It feels super random, but it also seems like it is potentially operating as the gateway for him to kind of jump worlds again by the way that the chapter ends anyway.
I don't mean to nitpick too much. I do think it's that section is kind of more about the general psychedelic experience, where it does remind me of, because a lot of times stationary objects seem to move more visually when I'm on mushrooms than when I've been on acid in the past. And the whole the part right before, the part where the wallpaper is growing and becoming this really in-depth depiction of a nocturnal city, does kind of remind me of the dreams you have after you smoke DMT. But the whole thing is just kind of vague. It's just reminiscent of psychedelics in general.
That's certainly,
yeah. And again, there is an aspect of visuals on acid that I could see if you're on a pretty high dose, that a lot of this stuff would happen as well.
Just to get in on this pedantry, good tasty pedantry. The panoramic stuff and the still objects becoming moving and stuff, I agree, Luke. Totally more of a tryptamine kind of effect. But that, like, looking into a thing and then having it break down into crystals, I don't know if I've ever had that experience on anything but LSD.
Yeah.
However, also the beavers of the brain are 100% like a reference to the Machine Elves of Terence McKenna, and like you can't get there on acid.
No, that does require DMT or an ayahuasca experience, from at least my understanding experience myself.
But beyond the pedantry, I, so just to give some fun chemistry, or I guess pharmacology trivia. Nitroglycerin, dynamite, which is dynamite, nitroglycerin with an inert thing to stabilize it. Cyclopropane, however, is a pharmaceutical, not one anyone uses these days because it's stupid. We have better options. But it's acts as an NMDA receptor antagonist as well as AMPA and certain acetylcholine receptor channels. And so what cyclopropane does to a real person is going to be fairly similar to the Gravity's Rainbow sodium pentothal scenes, except that the sodium pentothal scenes, sodium pentothal and ketamine, are going to be fairly similar, but cyclopropane is inhibiting all of the parts of the brain that make memories. So that's just fun. Beyond that, I don't know. I think it comes down to to some degree, Pynchon parodying the idea of like, oh, the 60s, the revolution of the 60s was a bunch of, all of these things had been set in motion, and then LSD was coming around, and it set off a bomb in society and changed everything. Which, obviously didn't change everything, except that now everyone constantly talks about the 60s. And I think it's in many in one way many times kind of just Pynchon's general, like, heartfelt appreciation, but also cynicism around psychedelics, kind of just pummeled into a single symbol, which is an explosive that is also an addictive substance that does all of the same things as all of the psychedelics all at once. And that's just an interesting device, because it's way more specific than any of the altered states that are really given in any of his other books. I mean, up until Inherent Vice, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. I can't find any way to add anything extra to what you've already said. I think you pretty much nailed it.
Do you want me to complicate it? There's also going inside the planet yields dwarves or gnomes. Going inside the meat yields beavers, but going inside the meat is going inside the mind of the viewer of the meat. I don't know. I think there's some overlap in these three symbols that are all small people singing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially, if you want to further complicate it, they do say, don't they mention that in the gismatic backup thing as well?
Too much time alone, gismatic juices backing up, putting pressure onto the brain. Oh, but hell, wouldn't that qualify half these mountains? In fact, it's kind of a naive theory, isn't it, Mr. Pong Hill? Not your own, I hope.
Yeah, no, I thought there was a further reference about having like women on particular.
It's in there. I don't know if it's...
No, yeah, not in the way that I thought, for sure. So then we get a story about the first ever dynamite blast that Lou had a chance to witness at a county fair in Kankakee, Illinois. And this is one of many explosions that essentially happened. There's this one, his sort of description of seeing the first ever one that he had experienced. And then from there, that leads him to kind of have this preternatural ability to know when something is going to explode or when a dynamite explosion is going to go off, which leads to yet another reference to gravity's rainbow for obvious reasons. We get this description of a homeopathic doctor that tells him that you can cure an ailment with very small specific chemical, which if allowed full strength would produce the same symptoms. So he thinks that maybe eating cyclomite had been helping him build up an immunity to explosion, which leads into the fact that somebody tries to blow him up. And it makes him knock out for a little bit. It makes him sort of see himself from above, but then eventually he works his way back down into his body, and he recovers. And he ends up by these two British people who have sort of come across his body. Before we get into the end of the chapter, do we have thoughts on the description of the first explosion that he ever witnessed, and then also this idea that he has grown a preternatural ability to sense them, and then, what happens when someone tries to blow him up?
I actually assumed that the motorcycles were going to be anachronistic in the timeline of this book, considering we're at like 1899, 1900, but they're not. I forget exactly when they were invented, but it would make sense that Lou would have possibly at least seen them at a county fair or whatever is going on, or the circus, traveling circus or whatever. I like that. I like that section a lot. It's just kind of fun. And yet another example of circuses in these two chapters. But the presentiment of the like explosion thing is, it's almost too obvious to mention that it's similar to the Slothrup's ability in Gravity's Rainbow, which my last read, I did a lot of thinking about what that whole thing is, and I didn't arrive to any solid conclusions. But I did do a lot of thinking about the details of it, of the map that he has of his sexual conquests, and as that relates to possible V2 strikes and his own daily schedule and stuff, where there's a few different ways you can interpret that whole thing, from it being just some type of like made up overanalyzation of statistics, all the way to, Slothrop is somehow calling death upon the people that he, the women that he is hooked up with for whatever reason, unconsciously or something. Definitely not consciously. I don't know, that whole thing is like Lou's ability to foresee dynamite blasts does not seem to really impact the story very much at this point, and I don't remember it coming up very much, or maybe at all, later in the book. Whereas the Slothrop thing is a pretty central aspect of the first section of Gravity's Rainbow.
It's very interesting, the idea that it was the end of his faith that things would always happen gradually enough to afford time to do something about it, and it was the shape. And pulling the shape into the next paragraph, talking about jumping into the explosion. The shape of an explosion, it's a pressure wave, right? An explosion is a pressure wave. It is. So there is a shape, there is a form of an explosion, and it is a mushroom cloud if you're being really grandiose about it. But it's it's like it's essentially like a vortex around a single point, and the specific dropping of the term zero and blackness. It's a lot like jumping. It's a lot like the mathematical models of a black hole in the event horizon. Like just the conceptually, the idea of being able to jump through a pressure wave such that it has already passed you by is essentially the same as like what you're doing mathematically when you're modeling what happens when something goes past the event horizon of a black hole. And I don't know what that means, but it's it gets me going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interest. It's a very fascinating couple of passages. Once again, we always say it, but if you guys have any thoughts on them as the listeners, please let us know, because there's obviously a lot of meaning laden in there. that isn't going to be the easiest thing to kind of extract out. But he does come back to his body. He does wake up, and he is greeted by Nigel and Neville, two dandies who are influenced by Oscar Wilde's style of dress, who are on a tour of the western states, and they say that he would probably be best off trying to kind of go out on the lam, and then whoever tried to blow him up is probably going to try and do it again. My personal theory there is that now that he's turned tail, the mining companies or some subsidiary thereof are now trying to get rid of him, and then they can easily just write that off as, well, it's just this just the same guy who just keeps going on and bombing more people. He knew someone was on his tail, so he got rid of him. From that point, he runs off with them, and the two of them are doing tarot readings up in the Nazi ruins, and he pulls the Hanged Man. For those who don't know, the Hanged Man card is a card that usually refers to someone experiencing new insights or new perspectives on something. The card depicts a person hung upside down but still alive, so they're looking at the world from a different angle, essentially. So this very easily maps onto what we've been reading about over the course of the chapter with Lou, very, very cleanly. And then finally, the two of them head out of the west, and he is invited with them to go off to England, because they have failed to get any souvenirs from the Old West. So they might as well bring a person. And the three of them board the ship. Well, two of them board the ship, and Lou gets stowed in the hold. And as they are going out, there is a quite historical storm. There's a Galveston hurricane that comes in and puts the city underwater and kills 6,000 people. And then we get this sort of cryptic closing line that says, wherever could you have been living before that frightful bomb brought you to us? Which seems to potentially indicate that he has changed places or states by a lot of people's theories that I read about online. And that brings us to the end of chapter 15. Do we have any thoughts on these closing moments of chapter 15, or any other thoughts at all lingering that we want to discuss?
This is more of a general book question, I guess, for y'all. And I might talk about it a little bit too. But so I was reading some literary criticism about this book in a book of mentioned scholarship, and it mentioned that a prominent review of this book called it Moby Dick without Ahab or the whale. And I do think these two chapters kind of in some ways like exemplify that, where it's things are getting like, it's very, I would use the words virtuosic, and I would also use the word like encyclopedic to describe these chapters and some of the chapters that came before it, but a lot of the chapters that are yet to come. I guess it might be a little bit early in your read, Kate, to whether or not you can comment on that quote about Moby Dick or not, but I'm interested to see what you all think about it.
I'm gonna need you to narrow it down just a little bit. I feel like I missed something.
Yeah, I was just wondering what y'all thought about that quote from the review that said, "Against the day is Moby Dick without Ahab or the whale."
I don't see a similarity, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, just the amount of in-depth knowledge that's portrayed, I guess, is the similarity I see, and that it's a long American novel that attempts to in a very in-depth way, like investigate a certain time period, and like really kind of gets into the details of the subjects it portrays, and is kind of Moby Dick has all the sections about that are very technical. And although Against the Day doesn't have like the same type of like technical details thrown at you one after the other, there is a lot of technical knowledge behind everything he's talking about, where there's all these different subjects he seems to know so much about.
I would say from that perspective that you've articulated, I can definitely see that argument. The amount of research that I have had to do to articulate a lot of the the contextual factors of this book just for this show has been has been quite wide reaching. I now know the whole electoral history of fucking Conkling for one reference, So I think, if that's the spirit that the comment is coming from, then I can absolutely understand that comparison. Weirdly though, my first reaction to that quote was that it would be like an insult. Because I feel like Moby Dick without the whale or without the captain, you're describing a ship with no mission and no like helm, really. But from that perspective of it showing off Pynchon's like knowledge and his virtuistic capabilities and in historical sort of cross reference and research and all that, yeah, I totally see that comparison.
Yeah, sorry if I came off as like cold. I just feel very much that like Gravity's Rainbow is such a perfect encapsulation of that idea, of Moby Dick without the whale or the boat, that it feels kind of weird to bring that into Against the Day, which is a book that does have an airship, and it does have like many more like centered characters, and is much less about like the foolishness of searching. I guess that's why I disagree.
Yeah, I got you. And that's a good point about Gravity's Rainbow, where Gravity's Rainbow is a lot more like quest based than Against Today is. Where Against Today seems a lot more about like wandering through life without any central like driving force necessarily. I mean, I guess like I'm thinking of Kit, and maybe I'm getting into spoilers here because right now he's super obsessed with vectorism. But I mean, the narrative just kind of it follows a lot of people that don't, they're not like journeying through post-war Germany searching for like different groups, while different groups search for some kind of like holy grail type thing. So I do understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I guess like to me, Moby Dick is a story about disillusionment, and so when you asking this question in this context, like, yeah, no, this is the end of Moby Dick. This Lou just deciding to go off with these two random British dandies. Yeah, that's Ishmael getting rescued and surviving to write the book. But that's as far as I can draw. But in terms of this particular chapter, I did want to just highlight the fact that Neville and Nigel are 100% drinking laudanum or smoking opium.
That does not
Yeah.
surprise me, given their proclivities of interest.
Lou had a close look at them. The boys were flushed around the eyeballs. Their pupils were tiny pinpoints you could hardly make out, and they were giggling so much you had to ask them to repeat things more than once. That is just what opioid users are like.
Very true.
That's a good point. Yeah, and that would somewhat account for how the closing section of the chapter is. Some of it is pretty fun to read in terms of just how odd it is. There's a lot of kind of small details that are really fun in that section. For that, it seems like kind of a montage of them traveling with like some cool, interesting highlights kind of interspersed. But it would kind of account for like how odd everyone is, like the whole second moon thing.
And then I guess the only other thing that I would want to bring up is that the last Pynchon writing that we covered before we moved into this section of the book was A Small Rain, which was pretty clearly about Pynchon's experience dealing with humanitarian aid as part of the army.
Yeah, that's
or the Navy.
True. I don't remember which one of them. The way that he has a very strong reaction to how many people died.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that Galveston hurricane disaster is, I think, one of the biggest disasters in Texan history. I didn't grow up here, so I only have heard about it since moving here. but you do hear about it sometimes, like on its anniversary and stuff. Still, where it's that's a pretty historic number of people dying, and that's actually a good connection to make that I didn't make myself. It's an interesting detail to throw in there as well for a few different reasons. I mean, it, again, just shows the amount of research that Pynchon must have done. Because I mean, I don't imagine that either of you were probably taught about that disaster in school. But I do think if you were to grow up in Texas, you would learn about the disaster in school.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was actually on Galveston Island during a tropical storm back in like the early 2000s. So that's how I learned about it, was from people talking about how scared they were that it was going to end up being another one of those. Yeah, definitely not a common knowledge thing.
It's also just horrible that Lou is kept in it in the cargo hold for 2 weeks as they cross the Atlantic.
That's pretty awful. Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess small price to pay for like a better life for yourself in the long run, but that's got to be torturous for 14 days.
It's the kind of idea that only an opium addict would think was a good one.
Even in the steamer trunk. So I think that brings us to the close of our discussion on chapters 14 and 15. Do we have any funny parts that we didn't talk about in the course of the discussion that we wanted to bring up?
We do get the phrase decadent East Coast swamp of lust on 158. Which maybe isn't laugh out loud funny, but it's so absurd. And
Yeah.
I kind of chuckled with just the phrasing of it is really funny to me. We do get stuff about somebody is being detained by an orgy, no doubt, on 157. Which is a funny would be a funny thing to say to make fun of somebody, or not make fun of somebody, but just poke fun at them or something. But there are those kind of details all over Lynch's novels. I did think that those two small examples were worth mentioning, though.
Yeah, in that same kind of way, I just really like the very clear distinction between the way that the vibes talk about their summer home and the fact that it is a huge mansion, because
Mm-hmm.
it is first introduced to us as a cottage.
It also supposedly has an aspect of abandonment, which you wouldn't think that a very rich family would have a ancestral home that had an aspect of abandonment to it.
Yeah, unless it was haunted, I guess.
Yeah, true.
Or is being alluded to the estrangement within the family who inhabits it.
Also true. Most Pynchon part of the chapter. What do we think? I think for me, it's the illusions with all of the different psychedelic experiences that Lou has. Kind of Will's elucidation of that section in particular. I think that sort of illusion that he's making, but also that very clear like experiential writing is probably pretty unique to Pynchon, of any of the writers that I can think of.
I think for me, the most Pynchon part of the chapter is the Loadazol Weekly Tidings thing, the whole fictional newspaper.
Yeah, the real estate speculation town.
Yeah, because it pokes fun at capitalism in general, but also at journalism, which it's hard to tell if Pynchon just has no interest in journalism, or if he has a disdain for journalism. But it's I feel like that's an aspect of it as well.
I guess, to my eye, the most Pynchon part of these chapters has to be just the unnecessary shoehorning in of outdated eugenicist theories. Because that
That's a
is,
good point.
they're never relevant. It's never needed. It doesn't improve anything other than add like a flavor of just distaste that is very much in
Yeah.
line with his other books.
And it happened twice. That's a great call out, Will. What about quotes? Who's got a favorite quote?
Well, I'll say my favorite quote period from this section are the two paragraphs that are just full of slurs. They are like ignoring that and the content of those paragraphs, which is just horrible. They are. I'm just not going to read them. They're long. They're dark. They're full of slurs. They're full of dehumanizing language. but the way that dehumanizing language is shaped is just beautiful.
Oh, totally fair. I also completely understand not reading that out.
I'm just not going to come up with a way to say like 3 different slurs in different ways that don't
Yeah,
sound
exactly.
horrible.
My favorite quote comes from 177, where it says, he had felt as early as the Pullman strike back in Chicago. Federal troops patrolling the streets, the city at the center of 20 or 30 railway lines, radiating with their interconnections out to the rest of the continent. In crazier moments, it seemed to Lou that the steel webwork was a living organism growing by the hour, answering some invisible command. He found himself out lying at suburban tracksides in deep nighttime hours between trains with his ear to the rails, listening for stirrings, quickening, like some anxious father-to-be with his ear to the abdomen of a beloved wife. Since then, American geography had gone all peculiar, and what he was supposed to be doing, stuck out here in Colorado between the invisible forces, half the time not knowing who hired him or who might be fixing to do him up. I pick this out very, very specifically because of the phrase here. He found himself out lying at suburban tracksides in the deep nighttime hours between trains with his ear to the rails, listening for stirrings quickening, like some anxious father-to-be with his ear to the abdomen of a beloved wife. That was just a moment where I was like, I wish I was that talented to write a sentence like that. It's just a supremely wonderful image that he's putting in the reader's head there, and it comes in a paragraph full of very Pinchonian imagery and kind of paranoia. It's great, but it's really that one sentence that made me just like stop me, like, damn.
Yeah, my favorite quote comes from 175. It's the first full paragraph. At the next convenient rise, he paused and regarded the peaceful valley. Maybe he had not yet seen it all, but Lou would be reluctant to wager more than a glass of beer that Chicago, for all its urban frenzy, had much on this country out here. He guessed that every cabin, outbuilding, saloon, and farmhouse in his field of sight concealed stories that were anything but peaceful. Horses of immoderate beauty had gone crazy, turned like snakes, and taken from their riders chunks of body flesh that would never grow back. Wives had introduced husbands to the culinary delights of mushrooms that would turn a silver coin to black. Vegetable farmers had shot sheep herders over some unguarded sleight of the eye. Sweet little girls had turned overnight into whooping, hollering brides of the multitude. Obliging men in the family to take actions not always conducive to public calm. And, as boilerplate to the contract with its fate, the land held the forever unquiet spirits of generations of Utes and Apaches, Anasazi, Navajo, Chiricahua, ignored, betrayed, raped, robbed, and murdered, bearing witness at the speed of the wind, saturating the light, whispering over the faces and in and out the lungs of the white trespassers, in a music toneless as cicadas, unforgiving as any grave marked or lost. I mean, I feel like that section kind of speaks for itself, in a lot of ways, and how beautiful it is. And I don't know if I want to mess it up too much by talking too much about it, but it does remind me of Cormac McCarthy a little bit, more than a little bit, even down to the prose and some of the phrasing. Pride of the multitude, I could definitely see Cormac McCarthy using that phrase. You know, the detail about the wife poisoning her husband with mushrooms is also kind of McCarthyian, as is the whole horse biting people, the flesh that would not grow back. Yeah, and I've written stuff where I've tried to kind of communicate like the history of a land in a kind of montage way, in a similar way to this paragraph. Although, you know, this paragraph is obviously not. It's not, this type of prose is not something I can currently achieve. But I really, there's a lot of paragraphs in these 2 chapters that I really love. There are other contenders. I could have chosen probably between at least 5 or 6 paragraphs in these 2 chapters. So
Yeah, it's a great passage, and I didn't think about it in terms of like Cormac McCarthy, but I absolutely see what you're talking about there. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you guys, as always, for listening. Hopefully, Cody will be back with us next episode. Certainly miss his voice around here. I'm sure you all do as well. If you think our show is worth $1, we would love to have it. We are able to be found on Ko-Fi for any donations that you may be able to spare at Mapping the Zone. You can also reach out to us with any thoughts or theories or questions you may have for us in a number of different venues. We are on Blue Sky at Mapping the Zone Pod. We are on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Podcast. We are also on Twitter, although we don't really spend much time on there outside of important updates, at Pinchon Pod. And you can find us, and our email address is our most sort of readily accessible line of communication at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. Next episode, we'll be going through chapters 16 and 17. And Will, do you have the quote for those with different pagination?
For those of us who do not have the standard American pagination, the final line of the section will be, "And there was that gaze again. Hours can be consumed," she pretended to lament, "by hat-pin issues alone."
If you, again, have that different pagination, that's what we'll be reading to. But we will see you next time. Thank you guys for listening.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.